Over the course of this channel's existence, I've become something of a scholar of American-born religions, and one in particular seems to keep popping up in those discussions. So today, hey, the people have spoken. It's time for another religion video. You're on my TV now? I thought I collapsed your timeline. Yeah, I figured out a way around that. Anyway, yeah, my audience has been strangely insistent on a religion video for some reason, so that's what I'm doing. That actually worked? Well, good. I wanted you to make a video about the Seventh-day Adventists for like over a year now. I'm actually talking about Christian Scientists today. I've already put in a lot of work and sacrificed way too much for this topic. I'm not changing now. But how are you going to make a religion video about a bunch of biologists and chemists? This isn't a science channel. No, not scientists who happen to be Christians. Christian Science is its own separate religion. You mean Scientology? What? No, I've already talked about that. That was the first religion video on this channel, actually. Christian Science is completely different. It was created back in the 1870s. I've never heard of it. Well, you should have. It's affected the lives of literally every American, including yours, in multiple ways. Wait, aren't you from the future? You should know all of this already, assuming this video came out. Are we even from the same timeline? What's that? Are you serious? You're breaking up. This video is brought to you by Henson Shaving. Well, super glad to have him back in my life. That'll be fun. So, while making this video, most of the people I spoke to about Christian Science reacted in much the same way he did. They either didn't know about the religion at all, or they confused it with another one, like Scientology or the Jehovah's Witnesses. I've made videos about both of those religions, as well as the Mormons. While there are a lot of parallels, Christian Science is a completely separate entity. It was created during the Third Great Awakening in the late 1800s by a woman named Mary Baker Eddy. She was a supporter of abolition, women's rights, and the temperance movement, the one against alcohol and tobacco. In fact, on her way to a temperance meeting in Massachusetts, she slipped on the ice and injured herself so badly that it seemed like she may never walk again. 3 days into her recovery, she read the story from the Bible about the time Jesus healed a paralyzed man and became inspired by the Holy Spirit. Mary then rose from her bed and walked into the next room, to everyone's astonishment. That instantaneous healing inspired her to start writing Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, which became the foundational text for the Christian Science religion soon afterwards. In this book, she states that you should not consume alcohol, tobacco, or caffeine. A lot of religions born during this time period have similar rules. For example, the Mormons. But then she takes it a step further by saying that you shouldn't put any drugs into your body, including medicine, and you shouldn't go to doctors or hospitals. For that reason, Christian Scientists are often confused with the Jehovah's Witnesses, but that religion just refuses blood transfusions, not everything else. Now, nobody cares if you don't smoke or drink, or go to the doctor, or take medicine. That's your right as an adult, religious or not, in pretty much every country. The problem is when you force that decision onto your kids. Christian Science has occasionally popped up in the news for that exact reason, and we will be talking about a few of those cases over the course of this video. Starting now. In 1896, Samuel Clemens sought a Christian Science practitioner to treat his daughter Susie, who was dying of spinal meningitis. I'll get to what a practitioner does later on, but he quickly gave up on that treatment and took her to a medical doctor. Unfortunately, she died later that year. Samuel held a grudge against Christian Science for the rest of his life, not because the practitioner failed to cure his daughter, but for the false hope they gave him. More recently, in 1977, Rita Swan hired a practitioner to treat her son, who had an unusually high fever. After a few days without any improvement, she wanted to take him to a doctor, but was discouraged from doing so by the practitioner. Almost 2 weeks went by before she took him to the hospital, where he was diagnosed with bacterial meningitis and died a few days later. Rita withdrew her membership and also held a grudge against the church for the rest of her life. Now, I knew most of that before I started working on this video. My approach to this topic was going to be, what if temperance became a religion? What would happen if people took that idea to the extreme? But since the other religions I've talked about have similar restrictions, I figured I needed something to make this video stand out from my past projects. So I thought it might be fun to live as a Christian Scientist throughout the entire production and vlog the experience. The rules were simple. No alcohol, no tobacco, which was never a problem for me anyway, no caffeine, which I now realize is a problem for me, no recreational drugs of any kind, no vitamins or supplements, and no medications. I bent that last rule a bit because I do have a few prescriptions and I wasn't willing to sacrifice my long-term health for a video gimmick. So I decided that I couldn't take anything that wasn't prescribed to me by my doctor. My inhalers and mental health medications were okay, but ibuprofen, Tylenol, Tums, and any other over-the-counter medication was not. My doctor seemed much more excited about this challenge than I was. She scheduled me for some blood work, and we set up another lab draw at the 90-day mark just to see what would happen. I started the challenge on February 1st and announced it to my community Discord. About 20 people joined to suffer along with me. It was kind of fun. We had a whole support group thing going. Shameless plug to support the channel if you want to get in on the next one. That challenge should be much more difficult. The first week was pretty rough. I didn't realize how addicted to caffeine I was, and I had some pretty major headaches, made even worse by the fact that I couldn't take anything to stop them. Ice packs became my new best friends. The next few months were just kind of boring. There were a lot of events like Valentine's Day, the Super Bowl, birthdays, anniversaries, and St. Patrick's Day, all of which were fun, but might have been slightly more fun if not for this challenge, right? I seem to forget this every year, but I'm apparently one of those people who's sensitive to pressure changes, so the transition to spring meant a headache every afternoon for like 2 weeks. The biggest thing I learned during this self-imposed challenge is just how many headaches I seem to get. I filmed a few vlog segments which I originally planned to sprinkle throughout this video, one of which you'll see later from around the 6-week mark. That was around the time that I started reading my third book, and I realized just how far off my original thesis was. Christian Science is so much more than just abstinence from drugs and medicine. I stopped filming the vlogs, but I stuck with the challenge, mostly to see if I could do it, but also because I didn't want to disappoint my doctor. Everything was fine until the day I was supposed to start filming this video, and I got terribly sick, most likely the flu. That night, I was so nauseous I threw up. The second day wasn't any better. When I went to bed that night, I was either too hot or too cold. I tossed and turned so much that I barely got any sleep. When I woke up the next day, every muscle ached. I had a fever of 101.1. I told myself if it got any worse, like 103, I would take a Dayquil, but everyone in the Discord told me to take it now rather than wait for it to get worse. They guided me towards the right use of temporary means. So I took it, and I'm glad I did. Otherwise, this video probably would have come out much later than it already did. As with every religion, our story begins with its founder. Mary Morse Baker, as she was known at the time, was born on July 16, 1821, in Bow, New Hampshire. She was the youngest of 6 children to Mark and Abigail Baker. Halfway through her mother's pregnancy with Mary, Abigail experienced a divine visitation and became convinced that her child was holy and consecrated. Stories like that were not uncommon at the time, especially in New England. This was right in the middle of the Second Great Awakening. Joseph Smith discovered the golden plates in 1823, and William Miller predicted that the world would end in 1844. Nope. Mary's parents were members of a congregational church, which she likely attended while growing up. So once she came of age, she applied for membership. This is from her autobiography in 1891.
At the age of 12, I was admitted to the Congregational Trinitarian Church, my parents having been members of that body for a half-century. Before this step was taken, the doctrine of unconditional election or predestination greatly troubled me, for I was unwilling to be saved if my brothers and sisters were to be numbered among those who were doomed to perpetual banishment from God. When the meeting was held for the examination of candidates for membership, I was of course present. I stoutly maintained that I was willing to trust God and take my chance of spiritual safety with my brothers and sisters, even if my creedal doubts left me outside the doors. This was so earnestly said that even the oldest church members wept.
And then everyone clapped, I'm sure. Predestination is the idea that God already knows who will be getting into heaven before they're born, and it was a core belief in this church. Yet Mary was able to convince them to accept her despite not believing in that doctrine. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, Mary suffered from numerous illnesses that doctors at the time were unable to treat, which often kept her out of school. In 1843, at the age of 22, she married George Washington Glover and became Mary Baker Glover. He was a builder from the South, so 2 weeks after their ceremony, they moved down to South Carolina, and a few months after that to North Carolina. George died of yellow fever 6 months after their marriage, so penniless and pregnant with her first and only child, Mary moved back in with her parents. She gave birth to George Washington Glover II on September 12, 1844, and was immediately bedridden due to an illness. Boys from the neighborhood were employed to rock her in a custom-made cradle, which they jokingly referred to as swinging Mrs. Glover. Since she wasn't well enough to care for her son, her brother became his father figure, while a neighbor was brought in to nurse him. She was treated by a doctor in 1849 and became well enough to get engaged to a lawyer named John Bartlett. He went off to strike it rich during the gold rush and died in California. Her mother Abigail died just 3 weeks earlier. Her father rebounded quickly and married a woman named Elizabeth Patterson the next year. He then informed Mary that her son was not welcome to live with him and his new wife. Mary moved in with her sister, and George Jr. was sent 40 miles upstate to live with relatives. After being shuffled between a few families, he eventually ended up in the home of a former Baker family servant. A few years later, his new adoptive family took him to live in Minnesota. In 1853, she changed her name to Mary Morse Patterson after marrying Daniel Patterson, her dentist of 7 months, and the nephew of her new stepmother, which I guess would make them step-cousins? Is that a thing? Daniel was always traveling for work, and during his absences, Mary began looking for ways to heal herself of her various illnesses which plagued her since childhood. She began studying homeopathy and phrenology, the skull bumps thing. During this time, Mary kept a scrapbook of what she called gems of truth and dewdrops of wisdom, which were newspaper and magazine clippings of health tips, home cures, recipes, and poems. While Mary was providing homeopathic treatment to a patient with edema in 1856, she decided to give them unmedicated pills to see what would happen. And the patient recovered anyway. Rather than credit the placebo effect or the fact that edema usually resolves itself in a few days, she started to wonder if all illnesses had a mental cause. This is foreshadowing. In her defense, germ theory was still being developed and wouldn't be accepted as fact for another few decades. At this point in history, they were basically still in the dark ages of medicine. A few years later, the Pattersons' home was foreclosed on and all of their possessions were sold at auction, so Mary and Daniel moved into a boarding house. Mary Baker Eddy's biographers talk about this time in her life as if she was exceptionally poor and that boarding houses were somehow beneath her, but at this point in history, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all Americans were living in them. That's where How the Other Half Lives got its name. It was a collection of photographs which showed the upper classes the appalling conditions most Americans were living in. In March 1862, Daniel was transporting money for the war effort from the state of New Hampshire to Washington, D.C., and was captured by Confederates. He eventually escaped and made his way back to Mary that December. He opened up a dental practice in Lynn, Massachusetts, where he and Mary lived for several years. And Daniel became somewhat of a known philanderer. On the evening of February 1st, 1866, Mary fell on the ice and was seriously injured. A doctor was called to treat her and found her injuries to be internal and of a very serious nature, inducing spasms and intense suffering. This is the fall I was telling you about earlier. Christian scientists refer to it as the fall in Lynn. She was transported back to her home, was completely healed, and back on her feet just 3 days later. This is the moment Mary cites as her discovery of Christian Science and the healing method she eventually published in Science and Health. It's as important to her religion as the crucifixion of Christ is to Christians and the discovery of the golden plates is to Mormons. If you were to disprove that, the whole thing falls apart. 2 weeks after the fall, when she was supposedly completely healed through her own efforts, she wrote a letter to a former colleague named Julius A. Dresser asking for his help. We'll get to how they met in a moment. I know YouTubers say this all the time and viewers rarely do it, but there will be a quiz on this later, so pause for a moment and read it for yourself. I'll wait a second. Okay, so the important things to note here are
2 weeks ago, I fell on the sidewalk and struck my back on the ice. Was taken up for dead, to find myself the helpless cripple I were before I saw Dr. Quimby. The physician attending said I had taken the last step I ever should, but in 2 days, I got out of my bed alone and will walk.
She underlined that, not me. She will walk. She also describes her symptoms at this point.
The terrible spinal affection from which I have suffered so long and hopelessly, a paralysis of the bowels and digestive functions, are the worst sufferings I have at present.
And at the end of the letter, she states,
Won't you write me if you will undertake for me if I can get to you? I can walk some. The internal trouble is all.
I'm not trying to cast judgment here, but does that sound like a complete and instantaneous healing to you? The physician she's referring to in that letter was Alvin Cushing, a homeopathic doctor. In 1907, he was asked to provide a sworn affidavit for a biography of Eddy, backed up by his case notes from that day. Here it is. This time you don't have to read the whole thing, but I guess you could if you really wanted to. Here are the important points.
On February 1st, 1866, I was called to the residence of Samuel M. Boubier to attend said Mrs. Petersen, who had fallen upon the icy sidewalk and had injured her head by the fall. I found her very nervous, partially unconscious, semi-hysterical, complaining by word and action of severe pain in the back of her head and neck.
The next morning,
she declared that she was going to her home in Swampscott whether we consented or not. On account of the severe pain and nervousness, I gave her 1/8 of a grain of morphine, not as a curative remedy, but as an expedient to lessen the pain on removing.
Giving her morphine would explain the paralysis of the bowels.
I visited her twice on February 1st, twice on the 2nd, once on the 3rd, and once on the 5th. And on the 13th day of the same month, my bill was paid. During my visits to her, she spoke to me of a Dr. Quimby of Portland, Maine, who had treated her for some severe illness with remarkable success. She did not tell what his method was, but I inferred it was not the usual method of either school of medicine.
Remember this, we'll get back to Quimby in a moment.
I did not at any time declare or believe that there was no hope for Mrs. Patterson's recovery, or that she was in a critical condition, and did not at any time say or believe that she had but 3 or any other limited number of days to live. Mrs. Patterson did not suggest or say or pretend or in any way whatever intimate that on the 3rd or any other day of her said illness she had miraculously recovered or been healed, or that, discovering or perceiving the truth of the power employed by Christ to heal the sick, she had, by it, been restored to health.
He did not at any time say that there was no hope for her recovery, or that she had a limited number of days to live. She also never mentioned to him that she was healed after 3 days by reading the Bible. Given the letter to Dresser and Cushing's affidavit, I personally find it difficult to believe that she was completely and instantaneously healed. She didn't even start citing this as the discovery of Christian Science until she published her autobiography 25 years later. As for the severity of her injuries, the doctors said they weren't critical or life-threatening. And given that she was in fact able to walk again, I find her characterization to be a bit overdramatic. And this was by no means the first example of her hypochondriac nature. Remember that story about Mary joining the church at the age of 12, the one from her autobiography? Let's actually take a look at those pages. Recall that Mary did not agree with the doctrine of predestination.
So perturbed was I by the thought aroused by this erroneous doctrine that the family doctor was summoned and pronounced me stricken with fever. My mother, as she bathed my burning temples, bade me lean on God's love, which would give me rest if I went to him in prayer, as I was wont to do, seeking his guidance. I prayed, and a soft glow of ineffable joy came over me. The fever was gone, and I rose and dressed myself in a normal condition of health.
So, at the same time that she was applying for membership at the church, she became ill and was miraculously healed through prayer, in much the same way she claimed she was after the fall. Mary was constantly sick, so much so that she was kept out of school for a good portion of her childhood and adolescence. Her family described her illnesses as tantrums or fits. Sometimes she was convulsing on the ground, other times she would be rigid and absent. Their family doctor diagnosed her with hysteria mingled with bad temper. Hysteria has some pretty negative historical connotations. Its etymology traces back to the Greek word for uterus, and by the 1800s, it was a blanket diagnosis or dismissal, meaning, women, am I right? Her complaints included spinal irritation, neuralgia, dyspepsia, stomach ulcers, neurasthenia, catatonia, and hysterical paralysis. There's that word again, but in this case it means an emotional paralysis rather than a severing the nerve paralysis. Those all sound serious, but Mary had a history of experiencing grave illness followed by a dramatic recovery, leading many to believe that her symptoms were psychosomatic, meaning had a mental cause. This behavior earned her attention and sympathy from her friends and family in the short term, but letters between them suggested they eventually became wise to the act, describing it as hypochondria and malingering. Nowadays, we have a kind of folk label for the pattern Mary was exhibiting, youngest child syndrome, often characterized by being manipulative, attention-seeking, and self-centered. Mary continued this behavior well into her adulthood. During her engagement to Daniel Patterson, her father actually warned him against the marriage due to her chronic invalidism, though he obviously ignored that advice. She once sent urgent word to Daniel informing him of her imminent death, only to experience a remarkable recovery upon his return. When he was captured by the Confederates and put in jail, Mary checked into the Vail Hydropathic Institute, where they treated people using what they called the water cure. You basically drank a lot of water and took a lot of baths. When that failed, she sought out Dr. Phineas P. Quimby, the most aggressively 1800s name for a quack doctor I've ever heard, who treated her using an alternative method. To explain Quimby's method, I need to stop for a moment and ask you a very important question. What is animal magnetism? When someone says they have a lot of it, what does that mean? Like me, you probably think it has something to do with innate sexual attraction or natural charisma, right? Well, the concept was actually invented in 1774 when Franz Anton Mesmer began treating people using magnets. Magnets were the fancy new technology of the day. People thought they were basically magic and could do anything. Obviously, magnets have existed in the earth forever, but they weren't refined and put to any practical use until the 1700s. According to Mesmer, animal magnetism is a subtle fluid that pervades the universe, uniting and connecting all bodies. The same fluid flows through all organisms, and a blockage of that flux causes disease. The cure requires a restoration of that flux. I know that sounds a lot like the Force, but as we all know, the Force comes from millions of tiny organisms floating around in our blood. That's canon, don't at me. Mesmerism sort of combines the theory of humors with magnets and hypnotism. He would restore the flow of animal magnetism by hovering his magnets over the affected area of the body and gazing into his patient's eyes. Nowadays, we talk about mesmerism and hypnotism as if they're the same thing, but hypnosis involves a trance-like state and mesmerism involves magnets. America was kind of going through some stuff when this was thought up, but it became incredibly popular in Europe. So in 1784, King Louis XVI of France formed a commission to examine mesmerism and see if there was anything to it. Members included Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, Benjamin Franklin, the US ambassador to France, along with many other doctors and scientists. The commission unanimously concluded that animal magnetism did not exist, and mesmerism was just a parlor trick. Benjamin Franklin suggested that the main reason patients were recovering was simply due to their avoidance of surgeons and physicians. Because at this point in history, going to a doctor was often worse than doing nothing. Following their report, mesmerism fell out of fashion in Europe, but then crossed the Atlantic and became popular in the United States. Quimby attended a mesmerism lecture in 1838, became an instant fan, and learned how to do it himself. For the next 2 decades, he traveled around the country healing people using his own variation, which he called the mind cure. He had an associate that would enter a trance, be controlled by him and his audience, and heal people. It was all an act, like many faith healers today. Quimby suffered from lower back and kidney pain for most of his life and was cured using his own method by his assistant. After which, he became convinced that the real illness didn't originate from his back or kidneys, but rather his mind. He believed that he had been deceived by doctors into thinking he was sick, and that they were doing that to all of their patients, feeding into the public's already existing distrust of medicine. Dr. Phineas P. Quimby opened an office in Portland, Maine in 1859 and treated people using magnetized water and head rubbing. He believed the theatrics of it were necessary to psychologically convince his patients out of their belief in sickness. He eventually began treating people absently, using just correspondence, believing he could simply argue people out of their illnesses, which actually wasn't that far off from what real doctors thought.
There are thousands of people who are willing to go to bed suffering from imaginary complaints. Every doctor has had experience with such. Frequently, they are given up by their physicians to become victims to their own imaginations, but often complete cures could be effected if sufficient mental force could be exerted on them.
On October 10, 1862, Mary M. Patterson was carried up into Quimby's office, but walked out of it a few hours later, having been cured of her spinal trouble. Within a few weeks, she declared that she had been cured of all of her ailments. Though cure is a strange word to use here, considering she continued to write him for absent treatment, but could only ever be cured in his physical presence. One could assume she needed his attention more than his actual healing. Mary became one of his most devoted students, perhaps even a disciple. She made numerous visits to his patients on his behalf, and it's during this time that she met Julius A. Dresser, the colleague she wrote that letter to. Quimby died on January 16, 1866, and she fell on that icy sidewalk in Lynn, Massachusetts just 2 weeks later, on February 1, 1866. At this point, I think it's safe to say that if Mary Baker Eddy were alive today, she would be the worst kind of Karen. She'd be all about alternative medicine, essential oils, astrology, crystal healing, copper-infused magnet therapy, and whatever it is Gwyneth Paltrow is selling. I can say that because she did all of the 1800s versions of those things: homeopathy, electrotherapy, hydropathy, mesmerism, hypnotism, phrenology, and other various humbugs, as she put it. She'd also be switching between various fad diets like keto, Atkins, paleo, vegan, juice cleanses, and whatever it is Jordan Peterson is doing. One of her diets was of bread and water only, developed by the inventor of the graham cracker. And to top it all off, in true Karen fashion, after she slipped on the ice, she tried to sue the city of Lynn, Massachusetts for damages. The petition she filed in the summer of 1866 claimed that the city was responsible for the dangerous state of the sidewalk and sought compensation for her serious personal injuries from which she had little prospect of recovering. Again, this is the summer of 1866, months after her supposed complete and instantaneous healing. After her recovery, Daniel Patterson had enough and abandoned Mary for good. He provided her with annual support payments until their divorce 7 years later. During that time, she went back to calling herself Mary Baker Glover. Without her husband's income, Mary was evicted for not paying her rent and began a decade of frequent moves between boarding houses and living with friends, students, and acquaintances. Her dramatic healing inspired her to begin teaching the method she had discovered, which was essentially Quimby's mind cure. She put ads in several spiritualist newspapers pitching her classes. Over the next few years, she had a few male students who became devoted to her before having a dramatic falling out. This will be a recurring theme. In March 1872, Mary stepped back from teaching to focus on writing her book on what she was calling the mental method, which had a few different titles until she landed on Science and Health. She submitted it to a publisher and it was rejected. She heavily revised it and it was rejected again. So 2 students contributed a few $1,000s to have it self-published. She bought a house in Lynn in March 1875, named it Mary B. Glover's Christian Scientist Home, and started teaching classes again. Then, on October 30th of that year, the first edition of her book was published. It was a mess. All of those missed years of education had really caught up to her. Stay in school, kids. According to church historian Robert Peel, sentences are chaotic, punctuation erratic, quotations inexact, and meanings obscure. That's a church official saying that. Just keep that in mind. There were run-on sentences all over the place, and paragraphs that went on for 6 pages. It was so poorly written that the church later tried to suppress its existence and obtain every copy that it could. Now, I was gonna do a bit here where I read that specific 2,200 word long paragraph, but hey, you still there? I have something for you to do. Oh, so now you want my input? All right, what do you want? I need you to read this for my video. Okay. Can I just leave it somewhere for you to find in the future? No, it doesn't work like that. Why not? Look, you're gonna have to burn it onto a DVD and put it in here. Who even has blank DVDs anymore? We both know that you do. So do you want me to read it or not? You couldn't break this into paragraphs or anything? No, it's supposed to be that way. The evermore of truth is changing the universe. Thought is expanding beyond words. We are losing our swaddling clothes, asking for more light, yea, reaching forth to the stature of soul outside the body. Bro, that was one sentence. What is this? It's the foundational text of Christian Science. Keep going. Let there be light is the demand of life and love, changing chaos to order and discord to the music of the spheres. Progress takes off all shackles, and the finite yields to the infinite. Advancing to a higher plane of action, thought grows new and rises from the personal to the... Right, so that would have taken me 11 minutes to read at my normal speed, so he'll be busy for a while. I thought I would take a moment to answer a question I get all the time. How do I choose my sources, and how do I know when a source is reliable? The answer to the first part is that I either search Google or Amazon for books on the topic and I read the reviews, or I ask my more bibliophilic friends if they have any recommendations. Or I reach out to people who are members of that group and ask them. The answer to the second part is a little more complicated. I can't really judge a source for accuracy until I'm holding it in my hand. Which brings me to this book by Gillian Gill. I was a little over a month into my research before I got it. This was supposed to be my 4th book, but before I even unwrapped the plastic, I was skeptical. On the back of the book, there are the usual reviews praising it, and 2 of them raised some red flags for me. One of them says, "The best study to date, Mrs. Eddy emerges from Gill's warts and all treatment as a transcendent and powerful figure worthy of respect. A genuine achievement." Now, given everything I just told you about her hypochondria and writing ability, and everything I will tell you after this, I have a hard time understanding how anybody could describe Mary Baker Eddy that way. Another one reads, "Gill's biography reflects her unprecedented access to the Mother Church archive, and fully renders the worldly magnitude of Eddy's achievements." The Christian Science Church doesn't just give archival access to anyone. I know from other books that if they do, they usually have some say over what the final product will be. And if they don't like what you have to say, they'll enforce their copyright to prevent your book from ever coming out. And indeed, on the inside of the title page, there's a thank you to the church and its publishing arm for allowing her to use their copyrighted works. But, you know, you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, so I went about reading it anyway. At least until I noticed several egregious errors that diverge from Mary Baker Eddy's known history. The first was something I told you earlier, that at the age of 12, Mary Morse Baker was admitted into the Congregational Trinitarian Church. That was false. Churches keep pretty accurate records of births, deaths, marriages, and when people join. Mary was admitted into the Congregational Trinitarian Church in Sanbornton, New Hampshire on July 26, 1838, when she was 17. In an attempt to refute that, Gill states, "The critiques of Mrs. Eddy's childhood memories have taken various tacks. They portray the whole story of her struggle with the elders and their doctrines as a ridiculous, self-aggrandizing, sacrilegious fabrication. In fact, more recent documentary research has shown that as far as church membership goes, the gap in years between Mrs. Eddy's recollection and the contemporary records is much less than they claimed. Church records show that a very important and emotional revival meeting occurred near Beau when Mary was about 12, and it is possible that she may have come forward to declare her faith in public at that point. The revival she mentioned was put on by the Methodist Church, which made Mary want to convert, but she was discouraged from doing so by her father. The point Gill was trying to make is that although she didn't officially join until she was 17, she joined in spirit when she was 12, which in addition to being the wrong denomination, was geographically impossible. The Baker family moved from Beau to Sanbornton Bridge on January 11th, 1836, when Mary was 14. There's no way she could have spiritually joined the church over there when she lived 24 miles away in a town without a Congregational Trinitarian church over here. That's a full day's ride on a horse, one way. Which also calls into question this line from Mary's autobiography, where she says her parents were members of that church for half a century. Her parents were members of the Union Church in Beau when she was born. They joined the Congregational Trinitarian Church in Sanbornton on June 17th, 5 weeks before she did. Your next question should be, how do I know all of that? And the answer is that the Christian Science Church itself says so. This is from the Mary Baker Eddy Library, and this is from the Longyear Museum, both of which are church entities. And here's a church-produced documentary just to cap it all off.
The conflict in her early religious life reached the point of crisis when she was 17 and applied for membership in her parents' church.
I was unwilling to be saved if my brothers and sisters were to be numbered among those who were doomed to perpetual banishment from God.
The line they just quoted came from her autobiography, so they know Mary Baker Eddy claimed she joined at 12, and they also know that she really joined at 17. I have no idea why Gillian Gill tries so hard to take Mary at her word on this, even when the church acknowledges that she was wrong. And yes, that narrator was Robert Duvall. He's a Christian Scientist. But anyway, that was strike one. How far into this is he? Of being gives harmony to man. Loving God supremely is simply admitting soul above sense in all things, and loving our neighbor as ourself, because all have but one soul, and should recognize themselves soul, and not personal sense. Understanding our... Okay, that's enough of that. The second issue has to do with the fall in Lynn and the letter she wrote to Julius Dresser 2 weeks afterwards. Here's the letter as quoted in the book. I hope you studied like I told you to. Do you notice anything suspicious? I'll give you a hint. It's these 3 dots here and here. Do you know what that means? It means she cut something out. Care to guess what's missing? It's the symptoms she is still experiencing that she reports to Julius. Gill edited this letter to make it seem like Eddy's healing was more total and complete. The first line about paralysis of the bowels infers that she had taken morphine. The second line is about how she can walk some. A few pages later, Gill writes, the first key document was the letter the then Mrs. Mary Petersen wrote to Julius Dresser barely 2 weeks after her fall, and which I quoted in full at the end of chapter 8. Quoted in full, huh? The letter is clear evidence that although Mrs. Petersen did indeed recover by her own efforts from the effects of what she perceived to be a life-threatening injury, she still lacked the confidence in her power to remain well without the aid of a figure like Quimby. The contents of the redacted portions refutes the conclusion she reaches here. Now, I cut things out as well. I did it with that earlier quote from her autobiography about joining the church at 12. But when I do it, I'm cutting out information that's irrelevant to the point I'm making. Stuff about her father believing in predestination and the pastor wanting to expel unbelievers from the church. Not important, get it out of there. But more importantly, I don't tell you that I quoted it in full. Strike 2. At this point, I knew this book wasn't a trustworthy source. It was clearly biased in favor of Eddy and the church's view, so I decided to skip ahead to see what Gill had to say about the first edition of Science and Health. Just as a refresher, this is the book she's about to talk about. We know better than to say deity is the shadow of matter, but if matter is substance, God is shadow, and shadow never produced substance. Hence, matter must have created itself. The body of spirit is spiritual and not material, but principle or soul. Gill writes, when finally I forced myself to sit down and read the 1875 edition of Science and Health, my central and unexpected conclusion was that both Christian Scientist loyalists and their opponents have attacked and avoided the book because it was too radical. The real issue is the author's audacity, her daring to think that a woman like her, with her resources, could write a book that takes on the great questions of God and man. At the end of her analysis of the first edition, Gill states, writing alone and in a cultural vacuum, Mary Baker Eddy had defined for herself an ideal reader of some metaphysical sophistication and considerable willingness to question received wisdom, but she failed to find this reader in actuality. In my view, the 1875 edition failed because of the ignorance and stupidity of its public, not of its author. So if you don't understand this, or reflection, again, the discord that comes from the belief of soul and body and intelligent matter at once proves this theory of being a belief only and error. Mortal man is a very unnatural image and likeness of God. It's because you're ignorant and stupid. Just to remind you, historian Robert Peel and many others like him within the church think this book was incomprehensible. Gillian Gill takes the opposite view. Here she is on C-SPAN promoting her book.
But I think that for public consumption, Christian Scientists felt it necessary to say that I did not understand Mrs. Eddy.
I have to agree. I hope by now you understand that Gillian Gill's book goes to great lengths to portray Mary Baker Eddy as a transcendent and powerful figure worthy of respect, even if it goes against the church's understanding of their own founder. And you might think this is relatively harmless. It's a book from 1999 that isn't available digitally or in audio form. And that's where you're wrong. This is Mary Baker Eddy's Wikipedia page. I do not use Wikipedia in my research unless I need to double check a date, but even then it's not always reliable. When I began writing the script for this video, I decided to see what they had to say about Eddy, and it's pretty much just the church version of her history. Scrolling down, here are all of the sources. Notice how many of them are Gill, and here are the ones that are from church-approved historians and biographers like Robert Peel, or from Mary Baker Eddy herself. Imagine looking at the Wikipedia page for L. Ron Hubbard and finding out that it was written by the Church of Scientology. Would you trust that as a source? I hope not. And you know all of those people who lie to you by saying that they only use Wikipedia as a jumping off point for their research? Well, if they used Mary Baker Eddy's page, they would only be looking at biased, church-approved sources. Reckoning ourselves from the standpoint of soul instead of personal sense, we progress as spontaneously as light. Okay, we still have some time. Let's cut to that one vlog segment I was telling you about earlier. So I'm like 6 weeks and a few days in. I'm over the halfway mark, and I gotta say, I don't really feel any different. I've seen other YouTubers do 30-day challenges where they quit alcohol or caffeine, and they always end up saying that they feel like a new person or they're completely rejuvenated. I'm over 30 days and I don't really know what they're talking about. I don't feel like I have more energy or that my mind is less clouded or anything. It's just the same as always. I'm guessing that along with quitting whatever it is, they're exercising more or eating healthier. But I haven't really changed my diet or exercise routine, which is how science is supposed to be done, right? You just change the test variables. I wear a Fitbit that tracks my sleep, and according to this, it hasn't really changed. The one thing that I will say has changed is that I'm dreaming again. I've been telling my doctors for years that I haven't had dreams in like forever, and they never seem all that concerned about it. And I know that people usually forget their dreams like as soon as they wake up, but I haven't been having them at all. Now I am, and they're not as fun as when I was younger. Like, where are the sex dreams and the ones where I'm flying? Instead, I'm just getting these stressful and scary dreams, so I wake up in a pool of sweat. 3 out of 10, do not recommend. From talking to other people, it seems like caffeine might be the thing that was preventing me from dreaming, but since I've quit so many other things, it's kind of hard to tell. Anyway, I've got to film the sponsor segment now.
Hi, KB Morgan here from KB Morgan's Gold Pond Check Cashing Rena Center and Payday Loans. But today, I'd like to talk to you about Henson shaving. Did you know that the safety razor was patented just 3 years after Science and Health was published? Not everything from back then was a bad idea. Before the pandemic, Henson Shaving used to manufacture parts for NASA, including the Mars rover and the ISS. If you think they can't make a precision-engineered safety razor, you're out of your mind. Double-edged Mach 3 Platinum Fusion? What does all of that mean anyway? I'll tell you what it means since I'm an expert. Absolutely nothing. It's all marketing mumbo-jumbo. You don't need all that extra stuff. Real men shave using only one blade. Manufactured to the same standards as satellite components, the Henson AL13 exposes the blade just 0.0013 of an inch, less than the width of a human hair, and supports it so well, it physically can't flex like those cheap plastic cartridges we've all been using that barely get the job done. This thing is made of pure metal. No plastic, not even in the packaging. The Henson AL13 comes in a variety of colors and costs $69.99. Nice. That might sound like a lot up front, but if you pay any attention to how much you spend on those stupid cartridges, this thing pays for itself in less than a year. And while replacement blades can be found pretty much anywhere, if you use the code KNOWINGBETTER at checkout, they'll include 100 of them with your order. The Henson AL13, the last razor you'll ever need. Shave like a sir.
Found what belongs not to person, namely the enlargement of his being in love and wisdom that reaches beyond personal pain or pleasure, the loss of a friend has, perhaps, given you the explanation of this. Pain quickly informs us that personal pleasure is mortal, and that both are error. There, done. Good timing. We got through the sponsor and everything. You weren't watching me the whole time? I read all of this for nothing? Did you hear yourself? Nobody would have stuck around if we did. That's fair. Anyway. Wait, are you like in my TV? Is that why it's been all glitchy lately? Glitchy? Man, I've objectively helped all of your recent videos. All of? How did you get in there? I'm not going to explain that. Nobody would stick around if I did. He's not wrong. Nobody cares about the lore of these videos anyway. Now that Science and Health has been written, we should probably talk about what's actually in this book. If you paid any attention to what he was reading on the TV, you might have guessed that this is a bit of a word salad. It's in here that Mary introduces the 7 synonyms for God, that is, 7 different words that when capitalized all mean God. These words are mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, and love. In any Christian Science writing, when these words are capitalized, you should just mentally substitute that word for God. I know, right? I actually have posters related to the topic at hand this time. They used to just be references to previous videos. So anyway, in a sentence like,
The material man depends for happiness and life on sense instead of soul, on matter rather than spirit, hence the insufficiency he finds in himself or personal man.
you should really understand it as,
The material man depends for happiness and God on sense instead of God, on matter rather than God, hence the insufficiency he finds in himself or personal man.
If you don't understand the meaning of that sentence right now, that's okay. But just keep that substitution in mind as we go through other quotes. As I stated in the beginning, this book teaches Christian Scientists to avoid putting any intoxicants into their body. This religion began in the late 1800s, and Mary was a supporter of the Temperance movement, so that isn't a big surprise.
The depraved appetite for alcoholic drinks, tobacco, tea, coffee, opium is destroyed only by mind's mastery of the body. This normal control is gained through divine strength and understanding. There is no enjoyment in getting drunk, in becoming a fool or an object of loathing, but there is a very sharp remembrance of it, a suffering inconceivably terrible to man's self-respect.
A past version of me feels very called out by that quote, and I don't like it. Now, here's where things are going to start getting deep. If you're one of those people who just have me playing in the background, you need to stop what you're doing and pay attention. Christian Science is not a faith-healing religion. They're not praying to get over an illness or injury. They're praying to understand that the illness or injury doesn't exist. As stated in Genesis, God created man in his image and in his likeness. The Mormons take that to mean that God is a human, just like us. But to Christian Scientists, God is a perfect spiritual being, and therefore, man is also a perfect spiritual being.
Man is not matter. He is not made up of brain, blood, bones, and other material elements. The scriptures inform us that man is made in the image and likeness of God. Matter is not that likeness. The likeness of spirit cannot be so unlike spirit. Man is spiritual and perfect, and because he is spiritual and perfect, he must be so understood in Christian Science.
Man is spiritual and perfect. He is not matter, and he is not made up of material elements. Because matter itself does not exist. Everything you are currently experiencing around you is what Christian scientists refer to as error. Your mortal mind has conjured this reality into existence, and your belief in this material world is an error, something that must be corrected.
To the five corporeal senses, man appears to be matter and mind united. But Christian Science reveals man is the idea of God and declares the corporeal senses to be mortal and erring illusions.
To put this another way, the entirety of Christian Science belief can be summed up in what they call the scientific statement of being. Every child learns to memorize it, and it's recited during every church service. There is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. All is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation, for God is all in all. Spirit is immortal truth. Matter is mortal error. Spirit is the real and eternal. Matter is the unreal and temporal. Spirit is God, and man is his image and likeness. Therefore, man is not material, he is spiritual. I'm not a Christian Scientist, I just wanted to prove a point. Although I have been living as one for the last 3 months. When God created the heavens and the earth, light and darkness, land and sea, and everything else, he saw that it was good. Nowhere in Genesis does it say that he created anything bad. So if it's bad, it cannot exist. This is from a healing testimonial. We'll get to what those are in a bit.
How in the book of Genesis in the Bible it says that God made all the things in the earth, including all the creatures, and everything that he made was very good, and this lump was not very good, and so it obviously was not made by God. And if it wasn't made by God, and God is omnipotent, then it couldn't have any being.
And just so you don't think I'm picking on some random lady, this is a lecture by a Christian Science teacher.
God is infinite good, God is all good, God is only good, God is the source of good, and God did not create disease.
You may recognize that as a variation on the problem of evil, which a lot of teenage atheists like to use as a gotcha. If God is all good and all powerful, why does evil exist? He either allows it, which means he's not all good, or he cannot destroy it, which means he's not all powerful. Christian scientists resolve that conflict by simply denying the existence of evil, which they often rephrase as sin, sickness, and death.
Because in Christian Science, you never ignore evil. Never. You look it right in the eye. And the purpose of your prayer is to gain such a clear understanding of God's all power and all presence that you can dissolve that claim of evil and reduce it right down to its native nothingness.
Do you see now why I dropped the whole temperance as a religion angle?
Man is incapable of sin, sickness, and death. The real man cannot depart from holiness, nor can God, by whom man is evolved, engender the capacity or freedom to sin.
God cannot perform evil acts because he is all good, and since we are made of God in his image and in his likeness, we are likewise incapable of evil. While Christian scientists believe in Genesis 1, where man and woman were created at the same time as perfect spiritual beings, they reject the story in Genesis 2. They don't believe Eve was created from Adam and that a serpent tempted her.
Well, chapter 2 of Genesis gives an entirely different account of creation. Now remember, it's an allegory. It's a story with a lesson. And Bible scholars agree that it didn't really happen. This is Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Therefore, there is no original sin. Man and woman were created perfectly, and they cannot be evil. How is that possible when you can look around and see people committing evil acts every day? Murder, assault, rape, war. You see these things in the news all the time. How can they deny that they occur? And here's where I'm going to tell you that you need to get used to the idea that Christian Science is a religion built on contradictions and unanswered questions. Although, within Science and Health, Mary Baker Eddy slipped in a little disclaimer stating that if you see any contradictions in her work, it's because you don't fully understand it. You're just too ignorant and stupid, as Gillian Gill would say.
It is sometimes said in criticizing Christian Science that the mind which contradicts itself neither knows itself nor what it is saying. It is indeed no small matter to know oneself, but in this volume of mine there are no contradictory statements, at least none which are apparent to those who understand its propositions well enough to pass judgment upon them.
Now, I'm sure many of you have been wondering throughout all of this, why is this religion called Christian Science when it doesn't really have anything to do with science? It's named that for much the same reason Mesmer referred to his whole deal as animal magnetism. Science was the new fancy buzzword. The field of science, as we know it today, didn't really exist back then. In fact, it had to be invented to prove cigarettes were bad for you. We definitely look back and call people like Isaac Newton scientists, but they would have called themselves natural philosophers. The standardized scientific method and peer review are relatively recent phenomena. So adding science to the name lent it credibility as the next big thing, kind of like companies who added .com or quantum or blockchain to their names to sound more advanced. Or for a more recent example, AI, even though none of it is really artificial intelligence. But while Christian Science isn't very scientific, I would also argue that it isn't very Christian either. We are all made of God. We are all God's perfect children. So Jesus is no more the Son of God than the rest of us, which in itself isn't too blasphemous. There are plenty of denominations that don't believe in the Trinity and just see Christ as a prophet. But since evil, or rather sin, sickness, and death, do not exist, Christ didn't die for our sins. In fact, he didn't even die. Christian scientists don't celebrate Easter for the same reasons you do. God did not resurrect Jesus after 3 days. Jesus healed himself using the method that Mary Baker Eddy would rediscover in 1866. By extension, Jesus did not heal the sick by performing miracles. He was using Christian Science. He was the original Christian Scientist. Believing in the crucifixion, absolution, and resurrection are pretty key features in most Christian denominations. Without those, I'm not sure this religion qualifies as Christian. The only reason they venerate Jesus at all is because they believe their modern healing method is the same as the one Christ used. In many of the stories discussing his miracles, he tells the person he just healed that he didn't do anything. It was their faith that healed them.
Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well."
This is why Christian scientists don't take medicine. It's not necessarily a rejection of science. They believe that as long as their faith is strong enough, they'll be healed. But how can they be healed from a disease they don't believe exists? Okay, so to a Christian scientist, a healing is any time you correct an error in your mortal mind. So understanding that the illness or injury does not exist is a healing. It has almost nothing to do with your physical body. But like, you can see it. You can feel a fever or a dislocated joint. No, your senses are just a manifestation of your mortal mind. The ultimate goal of Christian Science is to rid yourself of error, to free your mortal mind and become one with the divine mind, which is God. That doesn't... What? Didn't you hear what I said about contradictions and unanswered questions? Okay, but why not prayer and medicine?
The scientific government of the body must be attained through the divine mind. It is impossible to gain control over the body in any other way. On this fundamental point, timid conservatism is absolutely inadmissible. Only through radical reliance on truth can scientific healing power be realized.
This tenet is called radical reliance. For Christian Science healing to work, you must devote yourself to it completely. Going to a doctor or a hospital or taking medicine is an acknowledgement that disease is real. So if you do any of those, you cannot fully realize its non-existence. Materia medica, which includes things like medicine and surgery, go against the teachings of Christian Science. Still, to this day.
Another question comes up is, are you one of those people who don't go to doctors? Yeah, I always back up when I hear that one. It makes me cringe because I do not think of myself that way. Are you one of those people who go to God in prayer? Now that one I'll jump on. Yeah, that's me. Now another question that will come on the heels of that one is, okay, but what about using medicine with my practice of Christian Science? What needs to be understood there is that you have two different thought models, two different ways of thinking. In the medical world, thought for the most part is very matter-focused. In the Christian Science healing model, thought is very spirit-focused. It's two opposite ways of thinking. It's like trying to look left and trying to look right at exactly the same time. And the human mind can't do it. It's either one way or the other.
That's the whole of Christian Science belief in a nutshell. Since they don't believe in heaven or hell, they don't really take a strong position on how people should live, how the world will end, or anything else that you'd expect a church to do. The only rule that really seems to matter is that you should rely on your understanding of and connection to God, rather than materia medica. Since Christian Science was founded by a woman, it's often viewed as a progressive religion, at least when compared to other denominations. They refer to God as Father, Mother God rather than just Father. However, Mary Baker Eddy was not very fond of women, and it always bothered her that women made up the majority of her church membership. In the beginning of the video, I described Mary as a supporter of abolition and women's suffrage, because that's what she says in her autobiography. In reality, there's actually very little evidence for her support of either of those positions. She claimed that she freed the slaves of her first husband, George Glover, even though there's no record that he ever owned any. And while she supported equal rights for women under the law, her position on women's suffrage was complicated. She had a very traditional view on gender roles in a marriage.
Man should not be required to participate in all the annoyances and cares of domestic economy, nor should women be expected to understand political economy. Fulfilling the different demands of their united spheres, their sympathies should blend in sweet confidence and cheer, each partner sustaining the other.
Mary always preferred the company of men. Not for sex, she actually found the act to be repulsive, but she considered them to be her intellectual equals. She seemed to enjoy keeping one man around as a sort of pet, who would be especially devoted to her, obeying her every whim, until she got tired of him. This was a pattern she repeated throughout her time teaching the Quimby method and Christian Science. Remember those male students she had a falling out with? Near the end of 1876, there was a particularly bad breakup with a student named Daniel Spofford. He attempted to divorce his wife so he could ask Mary for her hand in marriage. She declined and banished him from her presence. Daniel didn't take that too well and wrote her several letters thirsting for her attention. On December 30th of that year, she wrote back,
Dr. Spofford, won't you exercise reason and let me live, or will you kill me? Your mind is just what has brought on my relapse, and I shall never recover if you do not govern yourself and turn your thoughts wholly away from me. Do, for God's sake, and the work I have before me, let me get out of this suffering. I never was worse than last night, and you say you wish to do me good, and I do not doubt it. Then won't you quit thinking of me? Do not think of returning to me again. It is mesmerism that I feel, and is killing me. It is mortal mind that only can make me suffer. Now stop thinking of me, or you will cut me off soon from the face of the earth.
To summarize this, she's saying that Daniel is too clingy and psychically suffocating her. and she seems to be under the impression that his constant thinking about her is causing her to become ill. Mary and modern Christian Science believe that the opposite of their method is mesmerism, or malicious animal magnetism. She was absolutely paranoid that her enemies were using it against her. While Daniel was still a student of hers, Mary healed a man named Asa Gilbert Eddy, and he instantly converted to her cause. He replaced Daniel as her favorite student, just as Daniel had replaced the guy before him, a man named George Berry. 2 days after Mary's savage letter to Daniel, she got married to Asa, and her name assumed its final form, Mary Baker Eddy. In the spring of 1877, the aforementioned George Berry sued Eddy for non-payment of his copywriting services and won. Eddy then sued Richard Kennedy, who was her favorite student before George. She won that case, but lost it on appeal. After that initial win, Mary instructed her lawyer to go on the attack and sue any former student who was speaking out against her. There were several cases, and we're not going to cover them all. But in May 1878, her lawyer convinced a former client of Daniel Spofford to file a lawsuit in Salem, Massachusetts, claiming he was using mesmerism to harm her. The exact thing Mary claimed about him in that letter. This became known as the Salem witchcraft trial of 1878, and is the only time in the history of the US legal system that a plaintiff accused a defendant of witchcraft. The judge refused to hear the case because, obviously, this ridiculousness was covered by every major newspaper and arguably made Mary Baker Eddy more famous than her book did, which drew in thousands of curious followers. I don't think Christian Science would exist today if not for these lawsuits. Her lawyer was later expelled from the church and sued her for lack of payment, causing the Eddys to lose their home and move into a boarding house. Asa Gilbert Eddy died from heart disease in June 1882. Mary believed that he had been mentally murdered by her enemies. Even after an autopsy was performed and she was shown his damaged heart, she stated that his death was caused by malicious mesmerism. If you're keeping score, 3 out of the 4 men she was engaged to or married to died, while the only one to survive abandoned and divorced her. I don't know, Mary, kinda seems like a you problem. Asa was soon replaced as her loyal male companion by a student named Calvin Fry, who remained at her side for the rest of her life. Thankfully for him, they didn't get married. The Christian Scientists Association was formed on July 4th, 1876, making Christian Scientists the official name for the followers of Eddy. A few years later, the Church of Christ (Scientist) was created, with Eddy as its pastor. The Massachusetts Metaphysical College was chartered in Boston in 1881. Mary then began calling herself a professor of metaphysics and Christian Science. She continued to revise and edit Science and Health, so shortly after the college opened, the 3rd edition was published. This was the first appearance of the scientific statement of being I recited earlier, and their new logo, known as the Cross and the Crown. It's around this time that several of her students decided to leave the church because of Eddy's behavior, and aired their grievances in a resignation letter.
We, the undersigned, while we acknowledge and appreciate the understanding of truth imparted to us by our teacher, Mrs. Mary B.G. Eddy, led by divine intelligence to perceive with sorrow that departure from the straight and narrow road, which alone leads to growth of Christ-like virtues, made manifest by frequent debiliations of temper, love of money, and the appearance of hypocrisy, cannot longer submit to such leadership.
Within a year, Eddy had rebounded, and her students gathered at the college to listen to her lecture on Thursday evenings and preach on Sunday afternoons. 1883 was a big year for Christian Science. They established their publishing company and began the Christian Science Journal, which is still in print today. It's full of church announcements, testimonials, and a few other things I'll get to later. But more importantly, the 6th edition of her book was published, including a glossary of biblical terms. So she changed the title to Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She had started to attract the attention of other Christian ministers, so in March 1885, they invited her to a public debate where they questioned her on her beliefs and accused her of pantheism, spiritualism, and blasphemy. Mary Baker Eddy assured them that she believes in one God and in the atonement of Christ, which seemed to satisfy some of the audience. What she didn't tell them was that she was working with a private definition of atonement. Christian Science doesn't believe in sin, so there was nothing to atone for. Instead, she believes in the at-one-ment of Christ. He had freed himself from his mortal mind and had joined the divine mind. Put another way, he became at one with God. This is also how Christian Science gets away with lying to people about their understanding of Jesus' parentage. Christian Scientists desperately want to be accepted by other Christian denominations as a legitimate church, so they will tell people that they believe Jesus is the Son of God, while privately believing that they are also a son or daughter of God. They believe Jesus, the man, was just a way shower. He wasn't divine. Christ is the ideal truth, a divine manifestation of God which destroys error. Anyway, Eddy split her teachings at the college into 2 courses. Primary class was for practitioners and consisted of 12 lessons over the course of 2 weeks. It initially cost $300, but was later reduced to just $100. Normal class was for practitioners who wanted to become teachers, the people who give lectures. It was only 6 lessons, but still cost $100. This class is only held once every 3 years. For hilarious reasons I'll get to later, both of these courses still cost $100. Mary began teaching a metaphysical obstetrics course in 1887, where she taught students how to mentally defend the mother and infant during childbirth. There were no lessons on physiology or delivery techniques. The next year, a woman named Abby Corner provided Christian Science treatment to her daughter while she was giving birth. Both her daughter and the baby died, so she was charged with manslaughter. Mary Baker Eddy denounced her because she hadn't taken the obstetrics course, which I'm not sure would have helped. Even so, Abby was eventually acquitted, and Eddy started encouraging people to seek licensed professionals for childbirth only. Just 3 months after the Corner case, a medical and homeopathic doctor named Ebenezer J. Foster was brought in to teach the anatomy portion of the obstetrics course. 2 weeks after he began teaching at the college, she adopted the now Ebenezer Foster Eddy at the age of 41. Mary had been reunited with her son George a few years earlier, but she was incredibly disappointed by him, especially since he was illiterate. So she found a replacement. In 1889, the Church of Christ (Scientists) was dissolved. Mary closed the metaphysical college, and she moved to New Hampshire. She told people that she was running from malicious animal magnetism, but the truth is that the government of Massachusetts was starting to investigate institutions that were peddling quack medicine and handing out spurious medical degrees. She was trying to avoid prosecution. 2 weeks later, Mary drew up a deed of trust which created the board of directors and instructed them to begin building a proper church in Boston. Eddy would never publicly admit this, but she hired a man named James Henry Wigan as an editorial assistant, and he was put to the task of fixing all of her terrible grammar issues in Science and Health. In 1891, his revised 50th edition was published. Mary always asserted that her book was written by a divine source, which meant that at this point, the divine source had changed its mind 49 times. In June 1892, Mary Baker Eddy moved into Pleasant View, her home on the outskirts of Concord, New Hampshire. She had several household servants, including housekeepers, cooks, aides, a coachman, and a groundskeeper. By all accounts, it was a nightmare to work there. According to Robert Peel, one had to have moral and spiritual stamina to live in such an atmosphere. Mary was still paranoid about malicious animal magnetism. It affected her health, food, air, and even the weather. She insisted on round-the-clock watches where someone was assigned to constantly pray to keep that evil force away. Wait, I thought you said they don't believe in evil. Christian Science is a religion built on contradictions and unanswered questions. Kate got it. She also demanded that they control the weather and end snowstorms. Her cooks would prepare 2 meals just in case the first one was tainted with mesmerism and she refused it. Failures to protect her resulted in verbal and physical abuse.
My dear students, guard your tongues. When you see sin in others, know that you have it in yourselves and become repentant. If you think you are not mortal, you are mistaken. I find my students either in an apathy or in a frenzy. I am astounded at your ignorance of the methods of animal magnetism. Your enemies are working incessantly, while you are not working as you should. Would that my head were a fountain of waters, and my eyes rivers of tears that I might weep, because of the apathy of the students and the little that they have accomplished.
During these years, Mary Baker Eddy rarely left Pleasant View. Christian scientists would gather by the thousands outside of her home every summer to hear her give speeches like the one you just heard. After a while, she wouldn't even speak anymore. She would just walk out onto her balcony and wave like she was the queen. She had a very inflated view of herself. Mary published an illustrated volume of her poems in 1893. It delighted her followers, but outraged mainstream Christians because she depicted herself holding hands with Jesus and gave herself a halo just like him. Mary Baker Eddy thought of herself as the equal of Christ. He discovered Christian Science back then. She rediscovered it now. Nowhere is this more self-evident than in her 1891 autobiography. We know that she joined the church at 17, so why did she say she joined at 12? Because when Jesus was 12, he walked into the temple and was likewise questioned by the rabbis and teachers. Mary slipped on the ice, injured herself, and rose from her bed after 3 days. Why? Because Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days. That divine visitation her mother experienced when she was pregnant with Mary? Yeah, where do you think that came from? On December 30th, 1894, the first service in the recently constructed church in Boston was held, and 600 members were inducted into the newly established the First Church of Christ, Scientist, also known as the Mother Church. Whenever a Christian Science church is built in a new city, that becomes a First Church of Christ Scientist. But only the Mother Church in Boston is the First Church of Christ Scientist. That's the only one that's allowed to use the definite article, the. Subsequent churches in a city are named Second Church of Christ, Scientist, Boston, Third Church of Christ Scientist, Boston, Fourth, and so on. Mary granted herself the title of Discoverer and Founder of Christian Science, and her students often refer to her as Mother, which I think is a play on how priests in other religions are usually called Father. She had an elaborately decorated room constructed in the Mother Church for her sole use, named the Mother's Room. She only spent 2 nights there, ever. The rest of the time, it served as a sort of sacred site. Christian Scientists would enter the room and pay homage to Mary Baker Eddy by praying to a large oil painting of the chair she sat in while writing Science and Health. There were rumors that, at first, it was a painting of Eddy herself, and that it was changed when outsiders heard about it, but sources can't seem to agree if that was ever really the case. In 1895, Eddy published the first edition of the Manual of the Mother Church, outlining the rules for her followers and how the church was to be set up. The church government consisted of a 5-member board of directors, who were chosen from among a 100-member body known as the First Members. These were persons who had proven themselves strict adherents to the doctrines of Christian Science. In reality, that just meant they were the most loyal followers of Mary Baker Eddy, people she had handpicked to lead the church. In order to prevent any individual from gaining a following and splitting off, Mary abolished the preacher position and ordained the Bible and Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures as the pastor of the Mother Church. The board then made Mary Baker Eddy the pastor emeritus of the Mother Church, a position she still holds to this day. As a result, there are no sermons in a Christian Science church service. Instead, 2 readers elected by the congregation take turns reading scriptures from the Bible and Science and Health. There is no personality in their services. Every Christian Science church in the world reads the same exact passages on Sundays and Wednesdays.
Is a Christian Science service similar to other Christian services on a Sunday morning?
On a Sunday morning it is. Yes, there's a sermon read from the Bible and from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. Hymns are sung. Silent prayer, the Lord's Prayer is said in unison, collections are even taken.
Christmas and holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so she's not lying, but the way she answered that question is incredibly deceptive. If you knew nothing about this religion, you'd hear that and think this was a pretty typical church. As part of my research for this video, I actually attended a Christian Science Sunday service, and I gotta say, it was one of the most painfully boring experiences of my life. Church already has a reputation for being boring, but this was on a whole other level. It really is just 2 people taking turns reading from the Bible and Science and Health. Those books aren't in the pews, so if you don't have them, you just sit there and listen. In most church services, there's a sermon on how to take a Bible message and apply it to your own life. The priest or pastor is a member of the community and crafts their sermon around what's going on in the world or what their congregation needs. But in Christian Science, it's two people standing at a podium reading a standardized script chosen by the Mother Church in Boston. Christian Scientists will often tell you that they believe in the Bible and science and health equally. They don't hold one in higher regard than the other.
And I got out the science and health, which is key to the scriptures, which is not our Bible because we study the Bible, but the science and health helps to explain the Bible.
Yeah, that's another one of those atonement at one-ment type fibs. The glossary, which constitutes the key to the scriptures part of the title, just redefines terms in the Bible to make it seem like it was talking about Christian Science all along. But science and health definitely comes first. How do I know that? Because the person known as the first reader reads from Science and Health. The second reader reads from the Bible. Mary told her publisher that since her students used the Bible and Science and Health together, they wanted the two books to be similar in size and appearance, and wanted them to use Bible-thin paper, which was expensive and difficult to work with. So in 1894, the 84th edition was printed using that paper, and every subsequent edition has used it as well. The Lord's Prayer is not said in unison as she told Larry King. Instead, the second reader and the congregation recite one line of it as it appears in the Bible, and then the first reader interjects with the Christian Science version. Our Father, which art in heaven, our Father, Mother God, all harmonious, hallowed be thy name. Adorable one, thy kingdom come, thy kingdom is come, thou art ever present, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Enable us to know, as in heaven, so on earth, God is omnipotent, supreme. Give us this day our daily bread. Give us grace for today. Feed the famished affections. And forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And love is reflected in love. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And God leadeth us not into temptation, but delivereth us from sin, sickness, and death. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. For God is infinite, all power, all life, truth, love, over all, and all. On Wednesday evenings, Christian Scientists gather for their weekly testimony meetings. There's a short service with readings from the Bible and Science and Health, followed by members of the congregation telling stories about their healings. The most impactful testimonies have something to do with a physical condition, an illness or injury that they were able to overcome.
I lost my focus and I stepped on top of the tennis ball and rolled over on my ankle. And I remember I was leaning up against the bathroom wall and I looked down at my foot and it was not in alignment where it should have been normally, and there was a protruding bump.
And I all of a sudden had a tremendous amount of pain in my midsection to the point that it just hardened up and I couldn't lie down. Really, what it seemed like it was food poisoning.
Another bicyclist and I collided head on, and his handlebars hit me right in the jaw and broke my jaw.
These testimonies aren't always about themselves.
A few years ago, my husband had a healing in Christian Science that I'd like to share. Over 32 bones were broken. Part of his face, cheek to jaw, was removed, and he was not doing very well at this point.
They don't even have to be about humans.
Well, I'd like to share a testimony. I've had many, but all of them are usually related to animals. We've had many horses and dogs throughout our lives, and I'm so sorry to tell you, but Roland, one of your quarter horses, has Coggins, and I'm legally supposed to put your horse down immediately.
This is about my dog, Mocha, who was really the favorite of all the dogs I've ever had. Mocha developed this nasty big lump on her side.
While testimonies of dramatic recoveries are the most memorable, remember that a healing is any time you correct an error in your mortal mind.
I've had healings, childbirth, jobs for my husband, buying and selling homes, relationship difficulties. It's just a way of life.
Did you lose your job and find a new one? That's a healing. Did you realize that a phone call was a scam? That's a healing. Did you lose your keys and find them later? Healing. Did you frantically search the parking lot for your car only for your son to remind you that you actually walked to that store? Healing. Was it raining when you were supposed to be working on your roof, but then it stopped? That's a healing. Did a hurricane change direction at the last minute and miss your home? That's also a healing. I didn't go to a Wednesday testimony meeting because it just felt too personal. However, the Mother Church in Boston puts the audio of all of their services on their website, and I've listened to several weeks of those. I didn't make up any of the healings I just told you about. They have both the Sunday service and their Wednesday testimony meetings available, but only for that week. There isn't a backlog you can go through. If you're curious to listen to any of these, the links are down below. Pretty much every testimony follows a basic formula. First, a brief description of the problem.
I was suffering from a cold where it was just very moist. My eyes are watering, everything, I'm blowing, I'm coughing, everything else.
Then the specific passage from the Bible or Science and Health that they used.
I opened up my Science and Health, and what really struck me was a paragraph on page 495 in Science and Health where it begins, "When the illusion of sickness or sin tempts you, cling steadfastly to God and His idea. Allow nothing but His likeness to abide in your consciousness."
Then a description of the resolution, which is always complete and total.
And I was completely healed. Where did all the stuff go? It never was. It wasn't a part of God's creation.
And finally, they express gratitude, especially towards Christian Science and Mary Baker Eddy.
And I thought of all the healings my family when I was growing up has had, and my family with my 2 daughters and my husband. And I just was just filled with gratitude.
So I just wanted to say thank you, not only to Christian Science, but to Mary Baker Eddy for what she gave us with this wonderful, wonderful way of thinking.
So I'm so grateful to have the support of our practitioners, the Sunday school lessons that I've learned over the years, and the support of our church.
Christian Scientists are encouraged to submit their healing testimonies to the Mother Church, where they'll often be included in the monthly Christian Science Journal or the weekly Christian Science Sentinel, which began in 1898. This is a Christian Science weekly from December 1898. The weekly was renamed into the Sentinel the next month. This isn't a reprint, this is the actual thing, and it's now the oldest thing I own. In my opinion, the reason they have these testimony meetings, and they're printed in every publication, is that Christian Scientists need constant affirmations that healings are a totally real thing. In 1954, R.W. England did a wide-ranging analysis of the healings reported in the various church periodicals and came out with a pretty brutal paper.
Most conspicuous was an apparent ignorance of or indifference to the natural healing powers of the human body. Thus, a vast number of minor ailments, ranging from athlete's foot to the common cold, were treated and cured by the application of divine truth. Furthermore, there is, among the 500 communicants, considerable attention given to types of disorders so insignificant as to be of practically no consequence so far as one's daily life is concerned. Chapped hands, lone warts, a burned fingernail, hangnails, vague fleeting pains, and momentary dizziness were not infrequently the healings for which testimony was given. When they vanish, as they almost inevitably must, Christian Scientists give credit not to their resilient organisms but to their religion. Thus, by virtue of the peculiar emphasis of their faith and the peculiar functioning of the human body, scientists have a constant and automatic source of evidence confirming their beliefs.
Okay, I guess it's his opinion too, but just remember that I said it first.
The number of cancers, tumors, broken bones, and cases of pneumonia and acute appendicitis which were self-diagnosed by the writers seemed large. It seems likely that most of the more dramatic cures are due simply to mistaken diagnosis. In scores of letters, the writers describe how they broke their skulls, dislocated organs, awoke in the night with pneumonia, decided that mysterious lumps were cancers, or found themselves in other ways serious victims of mortal mind. Elated and gratified when their skulls mended, their organs returned to place, their pneumonia and cancers vanished, they wrote letters of testimony to the journal.
The church has quite a few publications that still print testimonies of healing, including the Christian Science Journal, the Sentinel, and the Herald, which is the international version of the journal and began in 1903. One of the bylaws in the church manual states that members are required to subscribe to them if they can afford it.
It shall be the privilege and duty of every member who can afford it to subscribe for the periodicals which are the organs of this church. And it shall be the duty of the directors to see that these periodicals are ably edited and kept abreast of the times.
If you're not subscribed to any of these, or you're not a church member and you're just curious, you can purchase them in one of the many Christian Science reading rooms, which were created by the 14th edition of the Church Manual in 1899. Every Christian Science publication is available there. The periodicals, Bibles, Science and Health, the manual, everything. I mean, how do you think I got these? They're typically only open for a few hours a week, usually before or after a Sunday service or Wednesday testimony meeting. The rest of the time they're just sort of empty store windows.
Whenever I go into a town that's kind of rich, there's a Christian Science reading room, and the two things are going on. Nobody's in there, and there's books in the window. What is that? I'm not kidding.
I know, that's
this is like, you have, it looks like you have as many as Starbucks.
In Mary Baker Eddy's later years, her health began to decline and she suffered from kidney stones. In 1903, the pain was so bad she called a physician who gave her morphine. Hopefully you haven't forgotten by now, but that's obviously against the rules. But since Mary Baker Eddy was constantly revising Science and Health, she made sure to add an exemption specifically for morphine.
If from an injury or from any cause, a Christian Scientist were seized with pain so violent he could not treat himself mentally, and the scientists had failed to relieve him, the sufferer could call a surgeon who would give him a hypodermic injection. Then, when the belief of pain was lulled, he could handle his own case mentally.
You see, the morphine doesn't cure you, it just allows you to continue Christian Science treatment. In 1900, Mary was caught going to the dentist to have some teeth pulled. The Boston Herald reported on the story because it seemed to go against her own teaching, and she was invited to give a response.
If I employ a dental surgeon, and he believes that the extraction of a tooth is made easier by some application or means which he employs, and I object to the employment of this means, he thinks I must suffer because his method is interfered with. Therefore, his mental force weighs against a painless operation, whereas it should be put in the same scale as mine, thus producing a painless operation as a logical result.
I can forgive you if you think that was a vague non-answer, but I've read enough of her work by now to be able to decipher it. She's saying that if she goes to the dentist and he recommends that a tooth be extracted, but she refuses, he'll be so insulted that his negative thoughts, through malicious animal magnetism, will cause her more harm than if she just let him pull the tooth. To this day, Christian Scientists are allowed to go to the dentist. If it's anything more than a cleaning, they'll usually refuse Novocaine, even though it's a hypodermic injection. I didn't realize that until just now. Wait, so going to the dentist for a cavity you can't see is okay, but something like a broken bone, which you can totally see, isn't? Actually, Mary carved out another loophole specifically for those two.
It is better for Christian Scientists to leave surgery and the adjustments of broken bones and dislocations to the fingers of a surgeon, while the mental healer confines himself chiefly to mental reconstruction and to the prevention of inflammation.
Okay, so morphine injections, dental work, and broken bones, but not diseases or tumors or anything? Don't just tell me it's another unanswered question. Okay, so that one does have an answer, but I don't think you're gonna like it. Whenever a Christian Scientist is questioned on why they're allowed to do these things, but not those things, they will tell you that every member of the church is free to do whatever they want.
A student of Christian Science can do anything they want to. They're free to go to a doctor. They are free moral agents to make any choice they want to.
Why not prayer and the antibiotic?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
I'm asked that question.
It seems so logical.
I know. I'm asked that question all the time. And people do that, Larry. People are free to do whatever they want to do.
You're not thrown out of the church.
Not at all. There's nothing in the church that would say you cannot do this and you're not thrown out. No, nothing like that.
The reason they can claim that people are free to do whatever they want, even though Science and Health, through policies like radical reliance, say you can't, is that Mary inserted one last blanket exception into the book.
If Christian scientists ever fail to receive aid from other scientists, their brethren upon whom they may call, God will still guide them into the right use of temporary and eternal means.
So, if prayer doesn't work, you're allowed to go to the doctor and get treatment, or have surgery, or take Dayquil, whatever you need. But while that wide open loophole exists, most everyday Christian scientists will refuse to go to a doctor or a hospital or have surgery. They won't take medication of any kind. Most won't even take vitamins. They practice radical reliance. You're right, I didn't like that answer. 1907 was a particularly brutal year for Mary. In January, McClure's magazine ran a series of exposés discussing her various eccentricities, vanity, intolerance, and most importantly, her exaggerated and fabricated history. These articles are the main reason we know so much about her childhood, her hypochondria, and the infamous fall. They interviewed her family members, friends, neighbors, and even the doctor who treated her. The series by Georgine Milmine was compiled into a book which was published in 1909. Despite the fact that all of their claims were meticulously fact-checked and documented, the church denounced it as yellow journalism. Mary had created a system of one-man committees known as the Committee on Publication. Every state has one. They're known as COPs for short. Their main job is to correct false newspaper stories about Christian Science, Eddy herself, or members of the church. They even keep an eye on legislatures to guard against laws that might restrict church practices. That becomes important later, so remember that. Mary stipulated that they should all be men, unless none can be found, mostly because they were expected to regularly rub elbows with newspaper editors, journalists, and lawmakers. Do you remember back when I said that Mary Baker Eddy was using a private definition of atonement? Well, I was lying. It's not private. Because the Committee on Publication successfully lobbied the Merriam-Webster dictionary to add the Christian Science definition of the word to atonement. It's still there, right now. The exemplifying human oneness with God. Let's pick another word at random. I don't know, truth. The body of all things, a judgment proposition, sincerity. There it is, number 4, capitalized. Christian Science, God. How about life? Okay, scroll. There it is, God. All of the 7 synonyms are in there, actually. Mind, spirit, soul, all of them. Here's one that's really gonna surprise you. What's the definition of Jesus? Yep, Christian Science got their non-Son of God definition added here too. No other religion gets to have their particular understanding of Jesus or of Christ added to the dictionary. That's how influential the church's Committee on Publication is. When the Milmine book came out, they pressured bookstores and libraries not to carry it. Church members were apparently told to buy hundreds of copies and borrow them from libraries just so that they could be destroyed. As a result, the New York Public Library put it in the restricted area, where you cannot check it out and you are closely monitored by a librarian while you read it. They bought the original manuscript and even the copyright to it and successfully suppressed the book until it entered the public domain in 1971. The true author of the series wasn't discovered until 1993, 85 years after it was published. Turned out Georgine Milmine was a pseudonym for Willa Cather, the fiction writer. She apparently didn't want her career to be sullied by all of the expected drama. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of this video, I told you about a guy named Samuel Clemens, whose daughter died after failing to be healed by a Christian Science practitioner, and that he held a grudge for the rest of his life. Well, he wrote a series of articles about his views on the church for Cosmopolitan Magazine and North American Review using his pen name, Mark Twain. He combined them together to publish them in a book he titled Christian Science, which also came out in 1907. It's hard to understate how big of a deal this was. Mark Twain isn't exactly known for writing non-fiction. I read his book as part of my research and, to my surprise, he actually believes that Christian Science works.
Remember its principal great offer, to rid the race of pain and disease. Can it do so? In large measure, yes. How much of the pain and disease in the world is created by the imaginations of the sufferers, and then kept alive by those same imaginations? 4/5? Not anything short of that, I should think. Can Christian Science banish that 4/5? I think so. He has put all anxiety and fretting under his feet. what proportion of your earnings or income would you be willing to pay for that frame of mind, year in, year out? It really outvalues any price that can be put on it. Where can you purchase it? At any outlay of any sort, in any church or out of it, except the scientists.
He also expresses a fear that Christian Science will grow out of control, which is hilarious in hindsight.
Is it insanity to believe that Christian Scientism is destined to make the most formidable show that any new religion has made in the world since the birth and spread of Mohammedanism, and that within a century from now it may stand second to Rome only in numbers and power in Christendom? There seems argument that it may come true. It is a reasonably safe guess that in America in 1920 there will be 10 million Christian Scientists, and after a generation or two we will probably divide Christendom with the Catholic Church.
When you learn a little more about his history, his belief in their method makes sense. He did take his daughter to a practitioner after all. His wife Olivia was paralyzed in her youth and was cured by a mind healer. Like Eddy, she was also into alternative medicine and spiritual fads. Their daughter Clara was no different. In fact, well after Twain's book was published, she became a Christian Scientist. But the book is absolutely savage when it comes to Mary Baker Eddy herself. He goes in hard. He makes several jabs at her terrible writing and grammar, saying the book needs to be translated into English, and even guessing that she couldn't have written most of it herself. Which was true, she did hire an editor, but that wasn't known at the time. He also makes fun of the fact that her followers call her mother, and that she has a special room in the church where people pay homage to her. Clearly not embarrassed at all, Mary closed the mother's room shortly after this came out. Because of her ever-increasing reclusivity, Joseph Pulitzer published numerous stories in the New York World declaring that she was dead, or that she was a puppet of church leaders, or her assistant, Calvin Fry. In March 1907, he engineered a lawsuit on Eddy's behalf, alleging that she was not in control of her affairs. He obviously couldn't do that himself, so he got her son George and his daughter, one of Eddy's nephews, and the now estranged Ebenezer Foster Eddy to file the suit. They called themselves the Next Friends, which was another term for closest living relatives. To determine Eddy's competency, she was examined by a panel of masters, including a judge, an attorney, and an alienist. That's what we used to call psychiatrists. Let's bring that back. Since it was pretty likely that she was going to be found competent, because she was, the Next Friends dropped the lawsuit. She then publicly stated that this never would have happened to her if she was a man. And she's absolutely correct. Because of this series of events, Eddy instructed the church to create their own newspaper to be named the Christian Science Monitor. Whenever I bring this up to people, they seem to think that it's the Christian Science Monitor, like science from a Christian perspective, but it's actually the Christian Science Monitor, and it just covers regular news. The people who have read it regard it as a respected, unbiased newspaper. It's even won a few Pulitzer Prizes, funnily enough. But make no mistake, it is a religious newspaper.
Who runs the Monitor?
The editor, managing editor.
The board picks them?
The board picks them. The board appoints the editor, and then the editor hires the rest of the staff.
But the board does not influence editorially the paper?
No, we have an editor. The board has cabinet positions, Larry, and there is one board member who is manager of the Publishing Society, and he oversees the business and editorial side. So, yes, he does review every day the editorials and the cartoons.
So he approved the cartoons.
He approved the cartoons about you.
But he can say, don't run this?
Yes.
So they don't editorially influence the paper, but the board chooses the editor, and one board member oversees and approves everything that goes into the paper and can tell them not to run things? Sounds like they editorially influence the paper. One editor is even quoted as saying, "Christian Science thinking does indeed underlie all the conclusions in the Christian Science Monitor." Mary Baker Eddy gave the Monitor a missionary role, saying it was dedicated to the task of leavening human thinking. The leaven in this case is Christian Science. She said the Monitor would transform the entire mass of error. The fact that so many people think it's completely independent from the church is probably one of the greatest journalistic cons ever pulled. It's not the only religious newspaper masquerading as mainstream news, actually. The Washington Times is owned by the Moonies, the mass marriage cult from Korea. The Epoch Times is owned by the Falun Gong cult from China. You probably know them for their Shen Yun dance performances. Now, I will say that the Monitor's reporting on actual news is fair and balanced. The bias comes in when you look at what they don't report on. They rarely talk about crime. They don't talk about alcohol, tobacco, stimulants, or drugs, and will edit them out of pictures if necessary. Their coverage of medical news is extremely limited. Even in current times, they really only talk about the legality of government mandates. They don't recognize deaths, so they never run obituaries. If the person is extremely important, like the Queen, they'll just summarize their career. Mary Baker Eddy, a trailblazing author and healer who profoundly influenced the world with her innovative approach to spiritual health and well-being, passed away on December 3, 1910. She established a groundbreaking system of thought that forever changed the landscape of modern spirituality. I asked ChatGPT to write that one for me. She died from a case of pneumonia that lasted 2 weeks. In her final days, she blamed her impending demise on animal magnetism, saying, "It took a combination of sinners that was fast to harm me." Just over a month before her death, she completed the 432nd revision to Science and Health. It's now known as the 1910 edition, which is still used by the church. She also finished the 89th edition of the Church Manual, which created a huge problem because it had a number of clauses that required her approval before any action could be taken. Most importantly, no further revisions could be made to the manual, which states that the practitioner course shall cost $100. That's why they're stuck with that number forever. Additionally, every new board member had to be approved by Eddy. The first members had been dissolved a few years earlier. It was all up to her now. Some people interpreted this to mean that the mother church was supposed to slowly dissolve after her death, leaving the various branch churches to govern themselves, and for Christian Science to become a public good. I've spoken about this before. The death of the founder is a crucial moment. If there isn't a strong second leader to hold things together, the religion fades into history. Since Christian Science still exists, you can assume that's what happened. The board seized control and demanded that all of the branch churches bend the knee, so to speak. Most of them did, which is why they all follow the same standardized hymns, readings, and prayers as the church in Boston. Mary's funeral took place 5 days after her death. Her casket was under 24-hour guard until her tomb was completed in 1917. Some of her followers believe that the board was trying to prevent anyone from resurrecting her. There's a long-standing rumor that there's a telephone inside of Eddy's tomb for her use should she ever return. The kernel of truth there is that a phone was indeed installed for the guards, but it's unclear why. Once Mary Baker Eddy was gone, the church had assumed its present form. There were no more changes to Science and Health or the church manual. The self-elected 5-member board continues to run the mother church and all branches by extension. The church's membership was at its peak sometime after World War II, just as the evangelical movement was getting started. Throughout the 1940s, Christian Science was a fad religion in Hollywood. All of the celebrities were doing it, much like Scientology during the 80s and 90s. And do you want to know something really funny? L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer who lived in Hollywood during the 1940s.
You know, Scientology is something that you don't understand. It's like you could be a Christian and be a Scientologist, okay? Scientology is something...
So it doesn't replace religion.
And it is a religion because it's dealing with the spirit, you know, you as a spiritual being.
Gee, that sounds familiar. Scientology is the first religion I ever made a video about. And throughout my research on Christian Science, I was blown away by the many parallels. In Christian Science, you pray to rid your mind of error so that your mortal mind can become one with the divine mind. In Scientology, you audit to rid your mind of engrams so your thetan can become clear. This is just a pet theory of mine, but I think L. Ron Hubbard took Christian Science and just gave it a science fiction veneer. I mean, he even stole Mary Baker Eddy's origin story. He claimed to have healed himself of his crippling war injuries using the method he would later sell in a book called Dianetics, from which the religion of Scientology was born. Mary Baker Eddy healed herself of crippling injuries, wrote Science and Health, and created Christian Science. I mean, come on. Christian Science has been a long-standing feature in Hollywood ever since. Marilyn Monroe, Audrey Hepburn, and Elizabeth Taylor were all raised in the church and left it later in life. More recently, Ellen DeGeneres, Kelsey Grammer, and Robin Williams were all raised in Christian Scientist families. James Hetfield, the lead singer of Metallica, was born into the church and practiced it for many years. When his mom got cancer, refused treatment, and later died, he wrote the song "The God That Failed." There are a few celebrities who are themselves still members too. I mentioned Robert Duvall earlier, but did any of you see Top Gun 2, the sequel that came out last year? You know how Iceman couldn't talk? Yeah, Val Kilmer is a Christian Scientist who denied that he had throat cancer for years and didn't get it treated until it took his voice. That wasn't just a bit for the movie. He can't speak in reality. If you still aren't impressed, Alan Shepard, the first American in space, was a Christian Scientist. He took a microfilm of the Christian Science monitor to the moon on Apollo 14. In the years after the Abbey Corner case in 1888, the American Medical Association was on a mission to outlaw Christian Science, referring to it as spiritual snake oil. Hundreds of doctors and lawyers began organizing to introduce laws to ban mental healing and alternative medicine, but they failed. Even Mark Twain pointed out that if they passed and the Second Coming were to happen, it would be illegal for Jesus to heal the sick. Convicting parents for not providing medical care to their children was difficult. Prosecutors had to prove that a doctor could have saved them, which was still questionable at the time. In 1902, Merrill Reed and his wife were charged with manslaughter for not seeking treatment for his daughter's diphtheria. Their entire defense rested on the idea that the antitoxin for diphtheria was still experimental and ineffective. The jury agreed with that argument and the couple was acquitted. The same story played out in dozens of other cases around the country. Edward Whitney left his diabetic daughter Audrey with her aunt while he was on a business trip in 1937. The aunt was a Christian Scientist and she consulted a practitioner named William Rupert, who advised that they discontinue her insulin. Audrey died in a diabetic coma on December 10th. Both the aunt and the practitioner were charged with manslaughter, but the case was dismissed. Over 20 years later, Edward traveled from his home in Alabama to Chicago and shot William Rupert 3 times in front of a witness. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder because Rupert survived after undergoing surgery. Despite threatening it, planning it, traveling over state lines, carrying it out, admitting to it, and showing absolutely no remorse, the jury found him not guilty. Because, of course, right? Who could blame him? Kid going into a diabetic coma? No healthcare. Rupert gets shot? All the healthcare. I'm not sure any jury would see him as a sympathetic victim. He's a hypocrite who let a child die. Healthcare for me, but not for thee. By the 1950s, medical science had advanced to such a degree that the usual Christian Science defense was no longer accepted by the public. The church had to change tactics. Luckily for them, at this point, several health insurance companies began covering Christian Science practitioners, nurses, and nursing homes. We'll get to what those are in a moment. The church believed that these companies would only do that because their healing method had been proven effective. But in reality, Christian Scientists are extremely low-risk customers. They don't smoke or drink, they don't use drugs, they don't go to doctors or hospitals, and if they're ever in an accident or catch a disease, they're unlikely to seek treatment. They're paying for healthcare they will never use. It's basically free money for the insurance companies. Despite that, in 1965, the church used the fact that they were covered by those companies to successfully lobby Congress to include Christian Science services in the Comprehensive Health Insurance Act for the Aged, otherwise known as Medicare.
Benefits shall be paid with respect to services provided an individual by Christian Science practitioners during any calendar year. For purposes of this subsection, no person shall be considered a Christian Science practitioner with respect to the provision of any services unless he is listed as such in the Christian Science Journal at the time he provides such services.
Christian Science nurses are covered by the Act under the same section as LPNs.
Benefits may be paid with respect to services provided by a Christian Science nurse, only if such nurse is listed in the Christian Science Journal, current at the time such services are provided, as having completed nurses' training at a Christian Science Benevolent Association sanatorium, or as a graduate of another nurses' training course, or as having had 3 consecutive years of Christian Science nursing, including 2 years of training.
A Christian Science nurse is nowhere near the equivalent of a medically licensed nurse, like an LPN or RN. Not even close. Nurses in Christian Science are not medically trained. They're practitioners who have taken the primary class and then completed a training course at a Christian Science nursing home. They don't take any anatomy or medical classes. All they do is protect a patient from animal magnetism and make sure that the radical reliance policy is maintained. Their services are limited to applying bandages, bathing, moving, and feeding. They don't administer medication or provide physical therapy. They aren't even trained on how to take someone's blood pressure or pulse. These nurses occasionally make home visits, but are primarily based in Christian Science nursing homes, previously known as sanatoriums. Just like they did with Merriam-Webster, the church was able to get lawmakers to include them as part of the definition of a hospital.
The term hospital means an institution which is engaged primarily in providing, for compensation from its patients, facilities for diagnosis and treatment of bed patients under the supervision of a staff of doctors, and which provides the services of registered nurses 24 hours a day. In addition, such term includes Christian Science sanatoriums operated or listed and certified by the First Church of Christ, Scientist, Boston, Massachusetts.
This shouldn't come as a surprise anymore, but Christian Science nursing homes are not like normal nursing homes. They don't use respirators, feeding tubes, painkillers, or any other medical services or devices. It's a place where you're sent to slowly and painfully die. If you check in with gangrene on your foot, that can take forever. They're nightmare hospices. Mother Teresa would be very proud. The church told Congress that their nurses and nursing homes provide the same services as any other non-religious institution, which was a blatant lie. Now that they had federal recognition of their methods, they began lobbying state governments to pass religious exemption laws to child medical neglect, beginning in their home state of Massachusetts.
A child shall not be deemed to be neglected or lack proper physical care for the sole reason that he is being provided remedial treatment by spiritual means alone, in accordance with the tenets and practices of a recognized church or religious denomination by a duly accredited practitioner thereof.
That law passed, just like it did in a few other states, but the church knew that doing this dozens more times would be difficult, expensive, and time-consuming. So in 1974, they successfully lobbied the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to insert a mandate into the Code of Federal Regulations requiring exemptions to child neglect if they want to continue receiving federal funds for state social services. I couldn't find a copy of the 1974 version, but here it is from 1976 using the exact same wording.
Negligent treatment or maltreatment by a person responsible for the child's health or welfare, including the failure to provide adequate food, clothing, or shelter, provided, however, that a parent or guardian legitimately practicing religious beliefs, who thereby does not provide specified medical treatment for a child, for that reason alone, shall not be considered a negligent parent.
Within a decade, all 50 states plus DC had religious exemptions on their books. The Department of Health and Human Services removed the requirement as a way to receive funding in 1983, but no state repealed their laws as a result. Likely because this wording wasn't removed from the Code of Federal Regulations until 1998. Here it is as it appeared in 1997. It should be noted that Christian Science is the only church that benefits from this. No other faith has a religious alternative to medicine. Individual people might, but no recognized church. Throughout the 70s, Christian Scientists served in several important federal positions, which is likely how they managed to push these laws through. When Nixon took office in 1969, he brought a group of Christian Scientists into the White House, namely H.R. Haldeman as his chief of staff and John Ehrlichman as the White House counsel, and eventually domestic affairs advisor. Others included Nixon's speechwriter and one of Ehrlichman's aides, Henry Paulson, the future Treasury Secretary during the 2008 financial crisis. The key person of interest here is John Ehrlichman. Many of you probably recognize that name immediately. He's one of the masterminds behind Nixon's war on drugs. Makes a lot more sense when you learn that he's a Christian Scientist, doesn't it? But what you may not know about Ehrlichman is that he's the reason we have private health insurance in this country. Here he is, on tape, convincing Nixon to go with this plan.
Let me ask you, you know I'm not too keen on these. Let me tell you how I am on it. This is a private enterprise. Well, that's good. The advertiser is running from an educator for profit. And the reason reason he can do it, I had Edgar Kaiser come in and talk to me about this, and I went into it with some depth. All of the incentives are toward less medical care, because the less care they give them, the more money they make. The incentives are the right way.
The very next day, February 18th, 1971, Nixon proposed the Health Maintenance Organization Act to Congress, and it passed in 1973. John Ehrlichman never said that these policies were informed by his Christian Science beliefs, but come on. What we do know is that he was very much a practicing member at the time.
I was raised a Christian Scientist, and there came a time when I had a kind of crisis in my life. A small one, relatively speaking. I turned back to Christian Science, and it became my way of life. When I went through the Watergate episode, I very much relied on Christian Science. Got a lot of solace from it. Some very good results.
We're at the least fun part of the video. I'm going to go over a few disturbing yet important cases of child medical neglect. These are from the 1970s and 80s, but it still affects people today, and that should bother you. But if that's not really your thing, you can skip to the time code down below or fast forward until you no longer see me sitting in this spot. I'll give you a second. Okay. When Rita Swan, the Christian Scientist from the beginning of this video, was pregnant, her obstetrician felt a cyst on her left ovary. After she gave birth to her son Matthew on March 3, 1976, her doctor recommended it be removed before it turned fatal. Instead, Rita asked for a hypodermic, since that was allowed by her religion. The doctor refused, saying it would be an unethical band-aid treatment. Rita endured the pain for several months before relenting and underwent surgery that October. According to her, she had seen science do in 20 minutes what 6 years of Christian Science couldn't do. And yet she still went back to the faith. Between November 1976 and May 1977, her son Matthew experienced 3 separate fevers, which were successfully treated by a Christian Science practitioner. On June 18th, Matthew developed another fever. 2 days later, his parents called their practitioner Jean Leitner to do a house call, which was highly unusual because normally, well, I suppose I should tell you what a practitioner actually does, shouldn't I? First, they declare the allness of God and the truth about man, meditating on the many relationships between the two. Then, they deny the existence of the illness or injury and assert the nothingness of the symptoms or emotions of their patient. Christian Scientists believe there's a direct connection between your emotions and physical sensations. Pain is caused by resentment, rashes come from frustration, tumors are the result of anger, and fevers are brought on by fear. And finally, they reaffirm the truth that man is God, disease is a lie, and the 5 material senses are liars. They declare these statements to be the word of God with the power to heal. They might suggest certain Bible passages or lines from Science and Health to study, usually something that mentions the body part or ailment in question. But the key here is that they don't do any of this out loud. It's in silence, and usually they're not even in the same room as their patient. They're at home or in their office, providing what they call absent treatment, which is considered to be more effective. If you recall, this is what Quimby was providing to his patients, including Mary Baker Eddy. So on this rare occasion, Leitner came to their home. She made 2 visits the first day and 2 visits the next. She instructed Rita and her husband not to pray for Matthew because their fear is likely causing his fever. On the 3rd day, she declared that Matthew was improving. When he fell into a coma the next day, the Swans were so embarrassed that they called a different practitioner named June Ahern. She probed the parents' lives and discovered that Rita recently had a fight with her father and instructed her to write a letter to make amends. Within a few days, she declared that Matthew was improving, despite his paralysis and stiff neck. A few nights later, their son began screaming in pain. He was convulsing and gnashing his teeth. They were determined to take him to the hospital in the morning. But first, they called Ahern to inform her of their decision, and she immediately talked them out of it. She came over the next day, and the pain seemed to have subsided. She again declared that he was completely healed from his paralysis. But Rita and her husband weren't convinced. They said Matthew could no more walk than June Ahern could have flown to the moon. The Swans wanted to cancel a party they had planned for their daughter, but Ahern urged them to continue with their daily activities and to include Matthew as much as possible. Instead, they kept him in his room where he convulsed repeatedly throughout the day. When the party was over, the Swans finally took Matthew to the hospital to tell them that he had a broken bone. Because that's allowed. The emergency room doctors and nurses immediately regarded his case as serious. He had bacterial meningitis. The fact that his pain and paralysis were gone indicated that it already made it to his brain. He died 8 days later on July 7th. Bacterial meningitis is treatable with antibiotics, but once it makes it to the brain, there's really nothing anybody can do. Remember that Rita had a malignant ovarian cyst surgically removed, but she thought that Christian Science was going to heal Matthew the entire time. Yet another example of healthcare for me, but not for thee. Nobody was charged in this case because Michigan had a religious exemption law. And still does. After Matthew died, both Rita and her husband withdrew their memberships from the church and spent the rest of their lives trying to overturn the law that protected them from prosecution. In 1983, they founded a nonprofit named Children's Healthcare is a Legal Duty, otherwise known as CHILD, which educates the public on Christian Science and has lobbied the federal and state governments to repeal these laws with varying degrees of success. Over a decade later, they argued that Medicare and Medicaid payments to Christian Science practitioners and nursing homes were unconstitutional, since they were basically paying people to practice their religion. In 1996, the federal district court in Minnesota agreed, so now Christian Science nursing homes are only paid for the basic services they provide, like housing, bathing, and feeding, and practitioners no longer receive federal funds for their treatments. On April 8, 1986, a 2.5-year-old from Massachusetts named Robin Twitchell died from a bowel obstruction which began 5 days earlier. He was refusing food and was in a lot of pain, so a practitioner was called on the first day to provide absent treatment. The family then called the Massachusetts COP and was told that they could not be prosecuted for relying on spiritual healing. The parents hired a Christian Science nurse to come to the house. She gave Robin a bath and fed him 2 spoonfuls of applesauce. On the final day, he was vomiting up excrement and portions of his own bowels. His genitals had turned black from necrosis. This was the most horrifying death I read about during my research. How anyone could watch that happen and do nothing is beyond me. The parents were charged with manslaughter, and because of the gruesome nature of this case, it made national news. The father had previously needed a root canal and accepted painkillers for the procedure. On the stand while crying, he said, "If medicine could have saved my son, I would have turned to it." What do you mean, if? Both parents were convicted, but it was overturned in 1993 because they had been told by a church official that they'd be safe from prosecution, a fact that the jury was not aware of. Following that decision, Massachusetts repealed their religious exemption law. In November 1987, Elizabeth Ashley King, who just went by Ashley, was pulled from school because of a problem with her leg. The school arranged to have her teacher visit her at home to continue her education. 3 months later, Ashley's parents refused to allow the teacher into their house. After a few more tries, the school called Child Protective Services. On May 5th, the police showed up, and as soon as they saw Ashley, they could tell she was dying. They got a court order allowing them to take her to a hospital for a medical exam the next day. She had a tumor on her leg that measured 41 inches in circumference. Just for some perspective, an NBA regulation basketball has a circumference of only 29.5 inches. Yeah, Ashley had bed sores from being unable to move for months, and the cancer had spread to her lungs. She told a nurse, "You don't know how I've suffered. I'm in so much pain." Despite that, she was released from the hospital after 6 days. Her parents sent her to Upward View, a Christian Science nursing home, to die. When she cried out in pain, she was told not to disturb the other visitors. The parents were charged with child abuse and negligent homicide. The church even sent the manager of COPs to appear in their defense. Seeing that the trial wasn't going their way, they pleaded no contest to reckless endangerment and were sentenced to 3 years of probation. The mother then held a press conference surrounded by cardboard cutouts of Ashley and stated,
"The only analogy I can use to describe the terror, resistance, and sense of injustice Ashley felt is to compare it to what it must have been like for Anne Frank to be taken to the prison camp in Nazi Germany. I know I was a good mother, and no judge or jury in the country can convince me otherwise."
The next year, Upward View changed its name to El Dorado Vista to distance itself from the bad PR. This is the last one we'll talk about. On May 6, 1989, Ian Lundman, an 11-year-old from Minnesota, complained to his mother that he had a stomach ache. His breath had a fruity smell to it, but he was otherwise functional. The next day, they went to church because acknowledging an illness by resting gives it power. But at the same time, his mom gave him mints so that nobody would notice his breath. That night, he was complaining about his pain, so his mother called the state COP for advice. She then called a practitioner and a nursing home who instructed her to give him fluids and gave her the number of a Christian Science nurse named Quina Lamb. The next day, he couldn't eat, drink, move, speak coherently, or control his bladder. The nurse tied a plastic bag around his genitals to catch his urine while he lay in bed. She then sat by his bedside and took detailed notes of his condition throughout the night. This is basically a minute-by-minute timeline of an adult watching a child slowly die. Her only treatments were to drip water into his mouth and keep his lips moist with Vaseline. He died sometime around 2:36 a.m. on May 9th. Ian had juvenile onset diabetes. If he had gotten an insulin shot just 2 hours before his death, he would have survived. Both she and her second husband were charged with manslaughter, but like many other parents, they were protected by the state's exemption law. If you've been keeping track of all of the cases I've talked about throughout this video where a child died, one person was punished with a few years of probation.
I guess the most criticism has come when a Christian Science parent has a child die and didn't treat the child.
This Larry King interview I've been sampling throughout the video is with Virginia S. Harris, the chairman of the board of directors of the Mother Church. She was basically the leader of Christian Science at the time, though she would say she and the other board members are all equals.
How do you react?
I'm saddened. Anytime a child dies is tragic, Larry, whether they're shot on a school ground, whether they die in an earthquake, in a hospital under a pediatrician's care, or under the care of a Christian Science practitioner. So a parent, like any other parent's going to choose the health care that they can rely on, whether it's this pediatrician or that pediatrician, this medication or that medication, or Christian Science treatment. But no health care is 100% risk-free. We wish it were when it comes to children.
Let me pick that up in a minute. My guest is Virginia S. Harris, a rare appearance. We're happy to have her. She's chairman, board of directors of the First Church of Christ Scientists. This is Larry King Live. Don't go away.
Nothing should keep you from providing your child with the best medical care available. And at Shriners Hospitals, nothing will.
I didn't add that. The bootleg VHS recording of this on YouTube includes all of the commercials too. It's kind of a fun look back into the past. Here, check this one out. Once a millennium, humanity takes a giant technological leap forward. From writing on clay tablets, to papyrus, to the digital realm. KB Morgan Industries is proud to present the next step in human evolution. Completely redesigned from cover to cover, the all-new king-size Knowing Better notebook contains over 200 pages of precision-cut heavyweight paper, specifically formulated to provide you with the most exquisite writing experience imaginable. Each individually numbered page features 30 laser-printed college-ruled lines, providing you with half a mile of continuous writing space. The completely customizable contents page allows you to easily organize all of your intelligent thoughts, notes, and ambitions, making this the perfect outlet for all of your creative endeavors or data management needs.
The all-new king-size Knowing Better notebook by KB Morgan. Available only at the Knowing Better store.
Christian Science membership has always had an inverse relationship with advances in medicine, but following these controversial and widely reported cases, it went into a tailspin. Counting how many Christian Scientists there are is difficult because not everyone who follows Christian Science belief will actually apply for membership in a branch church or the mother church. In 1926, there were 202,098 Christian Scientists, 75.5% of which were female. Other churches only have 55%. In 1945, there were 268,915 of them, and that was the last time the church ever gave out their numbers. Only they know how many members they have today, and they don't make those numbers public. But since the Christian Science Journal lists every church, nurse, and practitioner in the world, we can extrapolate those numbers to give us a rough estimate. At its peak in 1941, there were 11,200 practitioners. By 1945, there were only 8,680. The number of churches peaked in 1961 with 3,273. By 1976, they only had 2,277. They had lost 1,000 churches in only 15 years. Now that I've given you a bunch of different numbers from the past, I'm going to tell you how many there are now. Because I have the Christian Science Journal from last month, and I hand counted every single one of them. Today, there are 859 churches in the world and 976 practitioners. In the United States, going by the assumed gender of their first names, about 80% of them are female. I counted and sorted all of this data by region, using the same categories as the journal. As you can see, the overwhelming majority of Christian Scientists are in the United States, with 85% of the nurses, 74% of the churches, and 70% of the practitioners. Modern subscriber numbers for the Christian Science Monitor are also hard to come by. It reached its peak in 1971 with 271,000 subscribers. By 1997, there were only 77,000 of them, only 25% of which were church members. Remember, the church manual states that it is the duty of all Christian Scientists to subscribe to the various church periodicals. In another strike against Wikipedia, they state that in 2011, the print circulation for the Monitor was 75,052. When you click their source, you're taken to a list of publications. If you search for Christian Science, you get nothing. Publishing Society? Nothing. Monitor gets you 3 hits, but they're clearly not the Christian Science Monitor. I have no idea where they got this number from. According to the New York Times, when the Monitor announced the end of its print edition in 2008, there were only 52,000 subscribers. They only print once a week now. The most recent data I could find came from the book God's Perfect Child, my main source for this video. The author states that in 2018, there were 31,096 subscribers, which follows the trend. Given all of that information, my best estimate for how many Christian Scientists there are today is 30,000. Newspaper articles from the last few years estimate a maximum of 50,000. The church I went to for Sunday service, in a major metro area, had enough seats to fit 500 people. On the day I went, there were only 30 people in attendance. Hold up. Why did you make this monster video about a religion with so few members? Because even while the church is slowly disappearing, they've had a substantial and lasting impact on the laws of this country. As of the making of this video, 41 states and DC still have religious exemptions to child neglect on their books. If those child cases bothered you and you live in one of these, maybe write to your state representative. Okay, I don't mean to sound heartless or anything, but that only affects the kids of Christian Scientists. Don't finish that sentence. You don't mean to sound heartless. These religious exemptions go much further than just child neglect. Christian Scientists have carved out a number of accommodations for themselves. Christian Science practitioners can sign sick notes to get you out of work, and disability certificates so you can receive benefits. For conditions they don't even believe exist? Exactly. Going to a doctor is against their religion, so they don't have to undergo employment or school-related medical exams like a sports physical either. Okay, I still don't see how that affects other people. In 1951, Cora Sutherland was a public school teacher in Los Angeles, where employees were required to get a chest x-ray every 3 years to test for tuberculosis. Since she was a Christian Scientist, she didn't have to. She died of tuberculosis in 1954, having had it for years. The county was forced to hunt down all of her former students to get them tested. They're also exempt from immunizations. At the Daycroft School in Connecticut, a Christian Science prep school, there was a polio outbreak in 1972. There were 128 cases, and 4 children were left permanently paralyzed. In 1982, a 9-year-old girl contracted diphtheria at Adventure Unlimited, a Christian Science summer camp in Colorado. She rode the bus back home to Wisconsin, and the state had to hunt down everyone for testing. A practitioner in St. Louis, Missouri opened the Principia School for Christian Science children in 1898 because she thought the public schools were too materialistic. And remember, when they say materialistic, they're not talking about how we are all living in a material world and I am a material girl. It's not the obsession with the accumulation of consumer goods. They're talking about the fact that stuff exists. Principia School eventually expanded to include a high school, with the first class graduating in 1906. The first graduation for Principia College occurred in 1934, and a separate college campus finished construction just a year after that. In 1985, there was a measles outbreak at Principia College. Of the 650 students and 175 staff, 100 people contracted it, and 3 people died. The CDC said they only see mortality rates like that in third world countries. Typically in the US, only 3 out of every 1,000 cases result in death. Afterwards, the state set up voluntary vaccination sites on campus, and over 400 students got the jab. Between 1985 and 1994, Principia experienced 4 major outbreaks, several of which spread to surrounding states. Today, there are only 322 students at the college and 435 students at the school. Some grade levels have class sizes so small they can be counted in the single digits. Most Christian Science children don't go to a special school though. They go to public school, and they have a religious exemption from required vaccinations. The church should really change its motto to Christian Science, the original anti-vaxxers. So you can just declare that something is against your religion to get out of it? I mean, not really. You have to have been around for... Can you just leave me alone already? I'm not going anywhere, buddy. I'm here until you make a video. Like I said at the beginning, nobody cares if you don't drink, smoke, take medicine, or go to the doctor. That's your right as an adult. But when you force those beliefs onto your children, you put them and the wider society at risk, regardless of whether or not you think diseases exist. Christian Science was born during a time when taking medicine was often more dangerous than doing nothing at all. Back then, members of the church had longer life expectancies than the general population, but by mid-century, they were basically dead even. And now, they're significantly worse off than the rest of us. Like Christian Scientists, the Mormons also abstain from alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine, and have always had longer lives than everyone else. So it really is just the medicine. The modern anti-vaccine movement began in the late 1990s when that one dirtbag faked a connection between the MMR and autism. And of course, everything got way worse when the coronavirus hit, though for different reasons. Both of those are piggybacking off of the medical skepticism and legal loopholes originally created by Christian Scientists over 100 years ago. When religious exemptions to immunizations and child neglect were originally written, Christian Science was the only church that really benefited from them. But since then, numerous small cults have popped up to take advantage of those laws. The Followers of Christ, a faith-healing cult in Oregon, filled a cemetery with dead children, causing the state to repeal its exemption in 2011. So the group moved across the border to Idaho. No other country let Christian Science change their laws to allow this, not even the UK or Canada. Christian Scientist parents in those countries have to get their kids vaccinated, and they have to take them to the doctor. A religious exemption to vaccines and child neglect, which only benefits one religion, sure seems like it violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Now that the religion is almost gone, maybe those exemptions should be too. Hey everyone, thanks for watching that monster video. As I'm sure you can tell, it took quite a bit of work.
I'd like to give a shout out to my newest Golden Fork patrons, Robert and Brian. If you'd like to add your name to this list of people who've reached at 1 mint, head on over to patreon.com/knowingbetter, or for a one-time donation, paypal.me/knowingbetter. Don't forget to heal that subscribe button or the join button if you want to be completely free of error. Check out the merch at knowingbetter.tv, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and join us on the subreddit.